Okay, I guess this is a good time to start. So welcome everyone. My name is James Yeku. I'm an assistant professor of African Digital Humanities at the University of Kansas. And I just want to thank you for being here. It's great to have everybody here supporting all the programs we do. Since 2019, the African Digital Humanities program at KU has fostered important discussions that emphasize the applications of digital tools and methods to the investigation of some of the pressing research questions currently taking place within the humanities in Africa. I believe in different contexts of post-colonial African studies, we seem to be currently faced with DH scholarship that includes the digitization and annotation of sources, some of which involve work on digital editions and data collections. And there are also other forms of digitally enabled quantitative and qualitative methods on digitized sources. This is in addition to work on the new digital ecologies that are supporting knowledge production and new areas of research on the continent. For instance, I know people are doing projects that are sometimes focused on digital archives on genocide memories in Rwanda, or even on data visualizations of carceral infrastructures in colonial Kenya. And some scholars are simply asking questions that are vital about the coloniality of data, for instance, on social media platforms. And all of us are asking questions about the ways in which AI systems reinforce epistemic violence and reinscribe dominant articulations of power. Now, in tracking some of these digital initiatives from several communities in different African countries, I've often found African data scholars using, for example, Python and other similar programming language for their work in natural language processing and machine learning. As a matter of fact, in a manner that extends a long tradition of computational linguistics dating back to the 1990s in countries like South Africa and Nigeria. And I mention this to gently push back at a certain dominant rhetoric of a digital divide that sometimes emerges as the basis for the discursive exclusion of the digitally connected in Africa. So through programs that center on the work of African scholars on the continent or in the diaspora, our African DH program at KU takes seriously the possibility of Africa as a generative site for scholarly productions that foreground the use of digital tools to better understand cultural productions and historical heritage on the continent. The symposium today invites us to consider the meaning of DH in the framework of African and African diaspora studies. Or to put it differently, what we are gathered to do today warrants us to ask in what particular ways can African digital humanities contribute to what Rupika Risam and Kelly Baker Josephs recently referred to as the digital Black Atlantic. Based on imagined digital iterations of the cultural and historical networks between Africa and its diaspora, the digital Black Atlantic partly motivates our keynote dialogue today, which is based on the possibilities of South-South collaborations and connections in digital humanities research. So this event is being held at the University of Kansas, for instance, and we've had connections with scholars from several African countries. But from today, we're thinking about the possibilities of collaboration, say, between Cuba or Nicaragua and, say, Nigeria or Ghana. Our two keynote speakers today represent two of the most original and provocative scholars working in these areas, people having this kind of conversations and pressing us in that direction. Dr. Hill's collaboration with colleagues at the Center of Digital Humanities at the University of Lagos in Nigeria is well known, while Dr. Mokeona is an important member of the African Digital Humanities program at Witts University in South Africa. We're excited to welcome both speakers along with all our panelists for today's event. Finally, and just to give a sense of some logistics, the keynote will be moderated by Dr. Sylvia Fernandez, who will shortly introduce our two keynote speakers, after which we will have our very important panels. Throughout this call, I will just please ask you to keep your microphone muted as much as possible And if you have any questions, please do use the chat panel. I believe our speakers will try to answer them as much as the time we have together permits. So thank you all for joining us today. And I should also thank in particular KU's Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, as well as the Kansas African Studies Center for sponsoring this event. And I'll now turn things over to Brian and Glenn to welcome you on behalf of these two sponsoring units. Thank you. Brian? You're muted, Brian.
You're muted.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, James. It's great to see all of you here from all over the world. My name is Brian Rosenblum. I am the co-director of the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities here at the University of Kansas. And we are delighted to be able to support this event for the second year, and we hope it's going to continue to thrive and grow. The IDRH here is a hub for digital humanities inquiry and practice at the University of Kansas, and we welcome everyone from the curious to the novice to the expert. But we also know that digital humanities does not stop at the edge of campus, and we aim to promote a kind of DH that is community and public focused, and we pursue a range of collaborations with partners on and off campus, regionally, nationally, and globally. And we seek to learn from our partners, listen to them, and are seeking to work with people on problems of common concern. We hold a number of public online events, guest speakers, and workshops, which you are all free to join. So please feel free to visit our website. I'll post a link in the chat and subscribe to our mailing list. And I just want to make sure also to recognize James for all the hard work he has put into building the African DH program here at the University of Kansas, and to reaching out across the globe to bring us all together. So I know we're going to learn a lot today, and I look forward to all of the panels and discussions. And I'll turn it over to Glenn to say a couple words too. Thank you. Have a great conference.
Hi, everyone. My name is Glenn Adams. I am the interim director of the Kansas African Studies Center, which is one of 10 centers, national resource centers for African studies that gets funding from the United States federal government to put on programming like this. And we're very pleased to support this event, which, as Brian noted, is coming to you for the second year in a row with under the really visionary leadership of Professor James Yeku. And we're very happy to have him leading this initiative. And I was going to say, you know, we're happy to welcome you, of course, to this event. We would like to welcome you in person, but that, I guess, is part of the beauty of this event, to think about the possibilities that the digital space offers for the production of knowledge and interchange. And we've all been sort of forced into that in the last couple of years, of course, by the pandemic, but rather than a constraint on what we do, is offered a lot of possibilities. And at the same time it offers possibilities, there are also some pitfalls associated with it, I suppose. And definitely it looks from the program that we're going to investigate some of those today. And I look forward to learning more about the topic. And then, like Brian did for the Digital Humanities Institute, I am also going to invite you to follow us at the Kansas African Studies Center. I will also post some information for you in the chat about how you can access our programming, a lot of which has gone virtual, which makes it, again, possible for people all across the world to access the various events that we have going on. And with that, I will say no more so we can get on with the programming. Thank you very much for attending.
All
right, so it's time to start. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever you're at. My name is Silvia Fernandez. I'm the current Public and Digital Humanities Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Kansas, and I have the honor to introduce the two keynote speakers for today's event, the second annual African Digital Humanities Symposium, titled South-South Collaborations in the Digital Humanities. The format will be, we will have first Dr. Hlonipha Mokeona from Witss University. She will talk for 15 minutes, and then Dr. Alex Hill from Columbia University will continue the discussion for 15 minutes. Then they will talk, they will have a conversation together, and then we will move for a Q&A, inviting everyone to present. Just briefly, a little bit about the speakers. Dr. Mokeona received her PhD from the University of Cape Town in 2005. From 2006 to 2015, she taught in the anthropology department at Columbia University in the city of New York. She is currently an associate professor and researcher at Witss University from Social and Economic Research at the University of the Witwatersrand, Hassenburg. Her articles have been published in Journal of Natal and Suhu History, Journal of Religion in Africa, among many other recognized journals. She has also written catalog essays for Sanali Muholu, and she's the author of the Abantu, Abanhami Lava, Babela Nawuka, and the Black People and Whence They Came. Dr. Hill, Alex Hill, is the Digital Scholarship Librarian at Columbia University, where he collaborates with faculty, students, and library colleagues in humanities research, pedagogy, and knowledge production that involves the use of advanced computation, digital media design, and network technologies. He is the lead coordinator for the Butler Library Studio at Columbia University Libraries, a tech-light library space concentrated on digital scholarship and pedagogy, and now a broadcast studio remote. He is also co-founder and moderator of Columbia's group of experimental methods in the humanities, a transdisciplinary research cluster concentrated on experimental humanities, one of the creators and main editors of Archipelago's Journal, a journal of Caribbean digital practice, and co-wrangler of its sister conference series, the Caribbean Digital. His research interests include Caribbean culture and history, with a concentration on 20th century poetry, digital humanities, and technology design for different infrastructural and socio-economic environments. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill and Dr. Mokeona, for being here. And I leave you the platform to you.
Sylvia, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you all for being here with us. It's about 6:30 or 6:15 in Johannesburg, 18 minutes past 6 in the evening. And so it's evening for me, but for the rest of you, it's morning, afternoon, and whatever other time of day that you are in. Thank you so much to Dr. James Yeku for inviting me. And thank you to the University of Kansas and the various African studies and African centers for hosting me and for organizing this event. So my story about digital humanities starts with the story of disaster. Some of you may know that earlier this year, in April of 2021, the University of Cape Town was engulfed by a veld fire, what in South Africa we call a veld fire. Essentially, the University of Cape Town is situated at the foot of a mountain, and the forest was accidentally set on fire, and the fire engulfed the university. Students had to be evacuated. The university had to be closed Firefighters worked around the clock to try and save the university, and they succeeded to some extent. But the number one victim, the irrecoverable victim, was the Jagger Library, which also happens to be the African Studies Library at the University of Cape Town. Now, after the fire, there was much, as they say, hand-wringing and sudden flustered conversation about digitization. Many people assumed that digitization would have somehow saved the material in the Jagger Library. But actually, one of the facts that transpired was that much of the archival and the important collections, including World Heritage collections at the University of Cape Town, were actually already in a fireproof basement protected lockdown, essentially. So the actual material that one would call the collectibles of the library were actually safe. But there was a lot of water damage because when the fire obviously was raging in the building, the sprinklers came on, and so much of the archive is now being freeze dried, if you can imagine that, so as to save it. These paper restorers and book restorers are working also around the clock to essentially restore the archive back to its original form. But what, as I say, transpired was that many people assumed that digitization would have saved the library. And so in many of the conversations after the fire, the recurrent question was, well, weren't the materials digitized? And so when you start to ask and try and find out what people think digitization means, it turns out that most people just imagine that digitization was about producing a copy of an item. So they essentially assumed that when you purchase a book or when the library purchases a book, all you need is a photocopy machine or a PDF scanner, and you scan the book and you put it in, you save it somewhere. What many people didn't realize was that actually digitization is a whole professional and long-term engagement. So that's the first aspect of digital humanities that many people didn't realize. Many people didn't realize how expensive digitization actually is, that when you digitize a book, you are actually paying more than what the book originally cost. Even if it's an out-of-print book, even if you buy the book at an antiquarian bookseller, you are paying sometimes 5 times what the book originally cost. So if you can imagine, in the case of South Africa, a book that maybe 50 years ago cost R1.50, which by today's calculation would probably be about $15. To digitize that book doesn't cost $15 or less. It actually costs more than $15 or less if you're just going to be digitizing that book. So many people didn't realize that digitization is a bulk enterprise in which you digitize things in bulk, not just one item at a time. And more importantly, many people didn't realize that digitization is not just about traditional texts. It's about digitizing VHS tapes, cassette tapes, CD-ROMs, CDs, albums, vinyl albums. It's about digitizing works of art. It's about digitizing sculpture. It's about digitizing a lot of even the library's own records. So that it's a mammoth task. It's not just simply about photocopying and keeping a copy. And the third issue that came up was the assumption that also digitization is a substitute for the purchase of actual books. So many people were already raising the alarm, saying things like, well, the university must not use this as an excuse to stop buying books. And it's like, well, digitization is not a substitute for book buying, precisely because many publishers are not really keen to go on the ebook market. And so many books, and for a long foreseeable future, many books will only be available in book form, in printed form. They will still not be available as ebooks. And then, as some of you then may have known, soon after that, we also had to deal with, or even at that time, we were already dealing with blended learning or online learning. So some of the issues that were coming up from the problems with online learning also clouded people's judgments of what digital humanities means. So many people were saying, well, there's no substitute for face-to-face contact. There's no substitute for actual libraries. The library must be restored. And again, I think all of those concerns come out of an assumption that the technology is somehow so overwhelming and so overbearing that it takes over everything. And in some ways, I would say, and this will come up in our conversation, in my conversation with Alex Gill, is that South Africa is in a sort of conceptual quagmire, exactly because we are not really short of money, in the sense that our government pays a lot of money for libraries, for archives, and many of our universities have had ongoing digitization projects. What we actually suffer from, when I say conceptual limits and conceptual problems, is that almost everyone has their own opinion about what should be digitized and what shouldn't be digitized. So let me give you an example. A friend of mine, who was one of the people who was working to dry some of this material that was coming out from the Jagger Library's basement, sent me a photograph of a Latin text that came out of the basement. And it is I think it was someone's dissertation from like, the early 19th century. And she sent me this. It's a beautiful object. It's all written in Latin. And so immediately the question becomes, well, do we need this archival material? What purpose does it serve to keep in the archives, whether digital or physical, a Latin text, which maybe 2 or 3 South Africans who learned Latin will be able to access? And so some of the issues that are coming out after the fire at UCT are the valuations of archival material and whether or not these materials are worth it. The second issue is the fact that for a long time, so I'll give you an example, for a long time, UCT absolutely refused to release to the public the actual monetary value of the items that were lost. Now, many people didn't understand why UCT was doing that. And one of the reasons why UCT was doing that was that one of the most valuable collections in the Jagger Library is what is called the Lucy Lloyd and Willem Bleek collection. Now, this is a collection of the Kam language, Khoisan language, that Willem Bleek started in the 1800s, and his daughter Lucy Lloyd continued. Now, that is a World Heritage collection. It's protected by World Heritage legislation and protocols. And it basically has an infinite value. And so UCT didn't want to have to explain to people that actually we were rushing to the basement largely to check whether the Lucy Lloyd and Willem Bleek collection was still intact. So those are the kinds of issues about people worrying about or wanting to know the monetary value of archival material so that they can evaluate in some ways what I would call their cultural or historical value. And then the other issue that came up was that the Jagger Library is also full of African authors that many people don't even know in South Africa. So African authors from the 19th century, people like Isaac Wauchope, John Knox Bokwe, people who many Black South Africans especially have never heard of, but many African scholars know who they are. And so then the question becomes, well, why was the public not introduced to these authors before the fire? Why is this knowledge being kept away from the public? So that is another issue that comes up with digital humanities. So before I end my opening, I also want to talk a little bit about the experience of the last 20 months with COVID and the lockdowns, and how, in fact, the South African government has shown some of the ways in which the South-South collaboration also involved public sector, private sector, government, university collaborations. So again, some of you may know that South Africa was actually sort of, if I can put it in quotation marks, stopped from working on a vaccine because the idea was we have other people working on the vaccine. But those are the kinds of stories that were circulating in South Africa about why it is that South Africa can't produce its own vaccine. But even before that, our government actually took the whole COVID prevention, COVID monitoring system online. So our government was issuing digitized information. You could find out what the COVID infection rate in your area is. So even our medical insurance companies were doing the same thing. You could have an alert system on your cell phone, which will tell you if you are entering a high risk area, etc., etc. And now with the vaccine, the state has also taken the vaccine program largely online. So we've all just been issued with digital QR vaccine certificates. Everything was done online. Booking for your vaccination was done online. After you receive your vaccination, you would receive a confirmation from the health department saying you have been vaccinated and this is your vaccination code, etc., etc. Now, what has become apparent from all of these things is that rather than make people feel comfortable about vaccines and vaccination, quite a lot of this sort of online and digitization has made many people feel uncomfortable with digitization, because now they assume that it means that the state is trying to control them and all the kind of conspiracy theories. So South Africa has been strange in that way, that the more that the state goes digital, the more suspicious people actually have become of the whole process. So as I say, we in South Africa, everything is largely digital and it's integrated. So for example, if you have private healthcare, so South Africa has a dual system. We've got public healthcare and private healthcare. But our government basically told the private sector in South Africa that they will not be treating any COVID patients unless the government hospitals become full. So everyone who tested positive for COVID had to be treated at a government hospital unless otherwise. And so by doing that, the state largely pushed the private healthcare providers to the side. And all that they did then was essentially send people loads of information about COVID. So when the vaccines also arrived in South Africa, the state took responsibility for vaccination and private companies were paying the state if you have private healthcare. And so you have this very integrated system where some people were mixing and blending. So you can get one shot, so like the Pfizer shot, you'll get the first shot at a government hospital, and then you'll go for the second shot to your private healthcare provider. And all of that was kept in sync by the state. So once you get your shot in the public health system, your medical insurance company would get a proof that you've been vaccinated by the government and vice versa. So the system was totally integrated, totally in sync. But as I say, rather than producing positive outcomes in South Africa, it has largely led to a lot of suspicion on the part of a lot of conspiracy theorists. So anyway, to conclude, I want to say that the disaster at UCT was one of the most pivotal moments, I think, in the last, let's say, 10 years, in the intensification on the conversation about digital humanities in South Africa. It forced universities to think about whether or not their own archives were fire protected, number one, so the physical archive. And then secondly, what they were actually doing to protect their digital possibilities. Did they have enough servers? Did they have enough storage? How many scanners were there? How many people were working on digitization? So in some ways, the disaster at UCT became the perfect moment for those of us who have been working on the digital humanities for the last 10 years or so, to actually come out and say, this is actually what we've been doing. This is how much it costs. These are the things that are important to us, those who are involved in digitization. This is how you evaluate the success or failure of a digital project. This is the future of digitization. So trying to map all those different things. And I'm hoping that in the Q&A, I'll get to tell you a little bit more about the actual project that I'm involved in, which is a Mellon-funded digital humanities project that is based at WISER. But I just thought for this opening session, or my opening talk, I should focus on the link between these two disasters. One, the fire at UCT, and then the next one, the COVID pandemic, and how it is that a university and the state sort of responded quite differently responded from a digital perspective quite differently, and how the two things also merge, and the possibilities that opens up for the study of how the humanities or how digital technology interacts with people and creates space for humanities research. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks again for being with us in this seminar.
Thank you, Hlonipha. This is a great way to start. I love the way that you connected both things that are easy to understand for a humanist, the preservation of archives, with the fact that these things happen in the context of digital lives that are being experienced throughout the whole society, and how you cannot do the one work without actually thinking of the larger context. So I'm glad that you connected this to like the government's response to the pandemic, the digital response. So I am going to talk a little bit about what we do in Caribbean digital humanities, some of our experiences, also thinking about these larger contexts in which we do that work. But before I get to that, I'm going to more or less set the stage for what I mean when I say digital humanities that is shared with others who have been working in this space for 10, 15 years and even longer. So I mean the combination of three things when I talk about digital humanities. The first is the sort of what Hlonipha called the digitization, what we could call digital archives, digital editions, etc. Not necessarily only archives of text, but of sound, video, etc. As Hlonipha said. I have a name for this sort of domain. I call it the architectures of knowledge, because it involves a lot of thinking about how we build these structures, thinking about their costs, thinking about the workflows, the labor, etc. After things are digitized, then that opens the stage for the second domain, which I would call the algorithmic approaches to corpora. Once these things become digital, they become data. So for example, most digital libraries, digital collections around the world have been built in an expensive way in order for people to browse and search and experience one item at a time. So they resemble in their structure the structure of a library, of a physical library, where you go and get a book and you look at that book and you look at one book at a time. What has not been done that much is the sort of approaching these digital collections as data. But we do know that once they are digital, and if the metadata, as we call it, has been done right, one can actually look at a lot of books at the same time, a lot of artifacts, cultural artifacts at the same time. And this is what I call the algorithmic approaches to corpora. Now, for example, there's work being done in a lot of work being done in the Caribbean and in a lot of parts of the continent in what we call corpus linguistic. In Nigeria, for example, I've had the pleasure of meeting many colleagues who are working on precisely this domain. The domain where one uses software that either one creates or that borrows from somebody else in order to analyze these collections as data. The third domain that is very important to me, and this is one of the reasons why I really love the opening statement by Hlonipha, is what I would call sort of humanistic interventions into digital sphere. This is like where we take what we know from doing the first domain and the second domain and use it in order to either communicate with our larger publics and to work with communities on the ground, but to intervene in moments of crisis. Now, this is what I mean when I speak of digital humanities. Most of my friends and colleagues around the world are working in one of these three domains or in all three. Now, within this conceptual framework, we have done a lot of work in the Caribbean over the past 10 years in order to develop the capacity of students and colleagues to be able to do this kind of work for many reasons, very similar to the ones that prompted South Africa to start thinking hard about digitization. We have a lot of fragile archives. We have a lot of work to do still in unearthing sort of the history of violence that is that was part and parcel of the historical process of colonization and conquest in the past 500 years. And working with digital tools facilitates this work. Also, we actually have a sort of duty to train young people to be able to harness these tools in order to themselves become contributors to the defense wall that we must erect against climate change, which threatens the Caribbean in very specific ways. It's sea rise and earthquakes threaten our people. So it becomes then a matter of life and death that we train young people to actually harness technology as much as they possibly can in order to be part, to make technology part of the arsenal of tools that they will use in order to defend our populations and our lands in the 21st century. Now, let me show you really quick a couple of the projects that we have worked on to do precisely this kind of work. So actually, let me just share my browsers. So for example, we have, one of the things we decided early on was that we were going to have a journal. This now in the 5th issue, with the 6th issue being in production, in order to give a professional incentive to people working in digital humanities in the Caribbean or for the Caribbean, place to publish, including the publication of digital projects themselves. In the issue number 5, for example, we have a peer-reviewed publication of 2 digital projects, one that maps Marronage, the sort of activities of the Maroons in the 19th century, and another one that maps the history of the Haitian Revolution. These are the very typical digital humanities projects, things that people do with digitized collections or data. Now, we also understood that community was key, so we needed to establish a place where communities of practitioners and theoreticians can come together every year. That led to the formation of our annual conference, which is now in its 8th year. The conference is going to take place very similar to this one. The African DH is a great work that James and the Kansas crew is doing on this. So it's a great necessity to have these spaces where we can talk to each other and exchange ideas. Ours has been happening for 8 years, and it hops between the US and the Caribbean region. Except of course during the pandemic where we've had to have it virtual. We've also done projects at sort of flagship projects that sort of show by example some of the possibilities. In this one, for example, where we map the trajectories, the life trajectories of historical figures in the 20th century in what James called the Black Atlantic world, with the goal of finding the places, intersections in time and space where these historical figures from Africa, South America, North America, and Europe find themselves in the same place. So for example, here in the 40s, we see that all these historical figures were in the same place. And besides this work of creating digital archives and computation, we also use these technologies in order to intervene, like the time we intervened after the Hurricane Maria destroyed the island of Puerto Rico, to rebuild the digital map that the Red Cross was using on the ground in order to help people during this crisis. We work with many partners in the Caribbean. One of the examples that I wanted to show, for example, is Create Caribbean, based in the island of Dominica, that actually takes this digital humanities work that is so important to us and involves high school students in the creation of these digital archives, working in tandem with college students and professors and librarians and other professional staff in order to make the sort of process of doing this cultural patrimonial work part of the whole community. And it's a fantastic example that is coming from the Caribbean, that is original to the Caribbean, led by my dear friend and colleague, Schuyler Spring. Now, these are some of the examples of the work we have been doing. Some of I want to conclude with some of the theory that drives this kind of ecosystem of digital humanities that we created. For me in particular, one of the things that was striking as I started to do work internationally, coming from the Caribbean, I was born and raised in the Dominican Republic. I'm an immigrant in the United States. So my country is still part of who I am. One of the things that struck me the most is what James made mention of, which is that we don't seem to be inhabiting a digital divide around the world, a simple have and have not two-sided coin, but that everywhere you go, what we do seem to have is just different environments, different relationships to technology. But there's always some kind of access to technology. And I've been to Asia, South America, the African continent, Eastern Europe, etc. And everywhere, what I find is just people having very unique relationships to the digital, both as scholars and cultural practitioners, and as just regular citizens. So in Cuba, for example, people pass articles on USBs, especially during the time when they didn't have that much access to the internet. This was the main form of sharing a scholarship with each other. So they would have potluck parties where you would bring your USBs and people would just bring their laptops and download articles that somebody got. They call this el paquete. Now, in Sudan, for example, there's no electricity from like 12 to 3 or something like this. There's heavy censorship from the government. So we worked there with a team to create digital archives that could exist in hard drives that only students within the university could access, but that to bypass the censorship. So the internet wasn't the answer, just simply offering these documents online wasn't the answer there. And everywhere else you go, you find these kind of different ecosystems. Even within the United States, we worked a lot with the prison system here, which holds our young people in long amounts of time awaiting trial with no access to technology. And using blackboards and notebooks, we were able to work, we teach them computation in order for them to create to allow them to create a Twitter bot that would allow them to tweet from prison, to express themselves from prison and about their prison conditions. So even within this rich city of New York, we find these different ecosystems, not necessarily, never a simple digital divide. It is within that context that we started thinking about minimal computing. We have very bad infrastructure in the Caribbean. A lot of people just have 2G. Not everybody has access to an expert, to a programmer. So we started thinking about what it's like to develop software and computation for environments like this. We've already created several prototypes, including a prototype for a tool to build digital archives within these conditions. It's the same one that we use in Sudan, for example, called WAX. The idea behind WAX is that we cannot afford necessarily to imitate the solutions of the rich countries, but that we can actually can create our own tools in order to do digital archives that are not that expensive, that is still fulfill the kind of requirements that Hlonipha was talking about, sort of like the kind of care to metadata that we need, the kind of preservation issues in the back, security issues and stuff like that, that tend to be very expensive when you imitate the models offered in the North Atlantic world, and reduce those costs. So we reimagine the whole thing. I won't go into details about how this is built and how it is used. It is now starting to be broadly used in the Global South and in the Global North because of the way that it actually addresses some of these problems. But that's just one example. We've since created, we explored many other ways in which we can actually create together in these environments. At the end of the day, the one thing that I am most interested in is not necessarily in our countries, in the Caribbean, to actually just try to catch up. I'm not interested in this idea of development where the model of who you should be is the people of the North Atlantic world. On the contrary, I'm interested in us in the Caribbean, developing technologies that work for us with our own creativity and imagination, in also hoping, but not a necessity, to influence the people in the North Atlantic world on how they should do things, because they live in such a wasteful people here in New York and everywhere else, they waste so much. They actually, the effects of the things they do are actually things that we live in the global South. And hopefully we can get to teach them how to actually do technology that is more conscious about the environment, that is more conscious about the people who suffer from these kind of techno-utopias that they built. And with that, I'll conclude. Hopefully, I'm looking forward to having a wonderful conversation with Hlonipha about these issues and how we together, working together in Africa and the Caribbean and perhaps Asia, we can continue this fostering of imagination that works for us, not necessarily in imitation of them. Thank you. James, I think you have to come back online and wrangle.
Yeah, we already have one question in the chat. Can I read it out? It came.
I think, I don't know if you were having a conversation before, but if you want me to bring the questions now, that's fine. There is a question for Dr. Mokeona, and it's from Jude, asking, how can Ludites in the humanities be made to view digital humanities as an enhancement of humanities scholarship rather than see it as a mere Silicon Valley rhetoric?
Thanks for that question, Jude. You know, the problem with technology is that it's cumulative. And so what has happened in some ways, so I'll give you an example of teaching. I started teaching in 2006. Now, when I was a student at university, again, because of the history of apartheid and the ways in which South African universities often couldn't get books, professors used to produce what was called a course reader, where, you know, the professor will essentially photocopy chapters and articles from journals and then put them together in a bound volume for you. So you didn't have to go to the library or to go and buy the books. So when I was a student, this was still continuing. And universities in South Africa in the 1990s started purchasing licenses for what are called Blackboard software, like Sakai, and paying money for it. But many professors were simply not interested. They were so used to the sort of routine of creating these course readers that even when an alternative existed, they didn't use it. So even when I was at Columbia University, many of the professors that I taught with in the anthropology department were not using what was then called courseworks. So I found myself sort of almost an outlier, because as soon as I started teaching, I started using online platforms to give students access to material, but also to allow students to chat, for example, about particular topics. So for example, if I was going to be absent, traveling to a conference, I would set up a chat or discussion online and allow the students to continue with the discussion even when I'm not there. So all of these technologies were already there. And it is only because of the pandemic that many professors for the first time are getting in touch with the technology. So I think the question of Luddites is more serious than just Luddites. I think a lot of it is about a fear of actually finding out what a particular technology is actually about. It's much better to simply dismiss it as, well, I don't need that in my life, instead of finding out what it's about. And then the second thing is the fact, as I say, technology is cumulative. So, I mean, many of us own machines, and for, you know, in the most generous reading is that we are using only about 50 or 40% of the capacity of our machines. You know, a lot of software, some people don't, like, for example, if you say to somebody, generate a table of contents in Microsoft Word, many people don't know how to do that. They are looking at you like, and you say, no, you have to create a code, You have to code your headings and then generate a table of contents. They have no idea what you're talking about. So much of the software that we already have, we are underusing it because we don't know what are its true capacities. So I think a lot of it just has to do with training and the fact that people are embarrassed to say, actually, I don't know how to use Microsoft Word. I just know how to turn it on, save a document, and then turn it off. I don't know what else to do with it. Or to use Adobe Acrobat. I don't know how to do it. I need somebody to show me, etc., etc. So I think there is an element of sort of cumulative failure where at the basic level, people fail to access basic technology. And then when that technology is then upgraded to something more formal like courseworks and Blackboard software, then they are left behind twice, if I could put it that way. They are missing two steps. And somehow you have to put into place training programs that sort of close the gap between those steps. But let me stop there, and maybe Alex has got something to contribute also to that question.
It's a very difficult question because it's also the technical knowledge is difficult, like you said. So a lot of people, it's not that they want to dismiss it, it's also because the demand on their time, like all of us are teaching and we have to write for promotion and these kinds of things. And there's already a book industry that has decades of history that develop and is more stable, a lot more stable. We're still experimenting left and right with what we're doing with the digital, because compared to the book industry, is fairly new. And a lot of people just don't have the time to learn. Learning was so painful for me because I was a graduate student when I started learning. In order for me to learn how to program computers and how to do the advanced work that I do today, I had to borrow a lot of money. In the United States, you have to borrow money to pay for school because it's very expensive. So I'm in a lot of personal debt. We don't necessarily, like, who wants to do that? It's the obstacle is really big for learning. So what happens is that faculty in the humanities then kind of like, I see a lot of faculty in humanities around the world just hoping somebody would do the part, that they would get assigned technologists, right? So that humanities people would get assigned people who will do the technological part because they don't have time to learn, right? Or they feel like they don't have the mind to learn this kind of mathematical things. So I only have mind to read the poems and this kind of thing. And the problem is most humanities people are broke, so they won't get assigned they don't have money, so they won't get not assigned these technologies that they dream that will be assigned to them. Most of the people who study technology in our universities, they go to work for finance, they go to work for banks or something like this, because also they're not stupid. They also have to pay the rent, you know, and they have kids and they have to. So all the people who know how to do the technological part, they choose another path because they have material needs. So this is a fundamental problem. I don't think there's an easy answer to this problem other than creating spaces in our departments where we can train young people to do both from the beginning. This is the only, it's not the only way to move forward, but at least it's one that I care a lot about, that teaching young people to be able to do historical work, critical work, and also technological work from the beginning of their career. But, it's also difficult because we're not rewarding these people. We're not rewarding these people with jobs. We're not, it's very hard to convince a young person that they should spend all this time learning all these things. If we are not even going to give them tenure, like if they get a job, like, well, but you have to write a book because that's what everybody else does. We write books. And if you don't write a book, you're not going to get tenure. Like, so maybe the hope is in convincing our own departments to do this. Another option is, of course, convincing people in computer science that they should care about narrative and they should care about history, and then just training people in those departments a little bit to be humanist. If our departments are going to be so conservative that they believe that everybody should just be writing books that only 200 people read, then yeah. Look, I believe also that digital humanities, like the future of the humanities, is communities. I defend the right that we have to work on very special subjects that nobody cares about, on very obscure things in the past. But if we are only doing that and not understanding that the humanities has to be a part of regular people, of their life, then I think we will fail. We will fail in this game. So maybe that's my answer to that question. It's a very difficult question.
Thank you, Dr. Hill and Dr. Mokeona. I'm a victim of Alex's proposal of training in the technical aspect, and it has been rewarding. Adding to another question from Roberta, it's to what extent should African digital humanities projects incorporate concerns for access so as not to reproduce digital divides? For example, should interfaces be mobile friendly? And I think this is a question for both of you.
Yes.
Is that the full extent of your answer?
Yes, make things for the phone. This is important. A lot of people use phones.
Right. So, but also the other part of it is that there is an element maybe of activism from the North. So I'll give you an example. I mean, Apple gives educational discounts to professors and students at American universities. It only started doing that in South Africa like a year ago, 2 years ago. We were not getting discounts for buying Apple computers. And also the already existing databases like JSTOR, for example, to pick one, or even the Oxford reference online or Oxford dictionary, many of those are paywall. You have to have access through your university, you have to have a license. And so I think there's also a way in which what is actually required, the things that should be mobile, are those licenses rather than, in fact, even the technology. So there's a space for licensing mobility, where if, for example, if I'm a professor and somebody in the street asks me about a project that I'm working on, I should be able to give the person access to that project, whether they use a laptop or a phone. So the mobility is also hampered by licensing. So just the other day, we were having a discussion about how electronic books are particularly difficult, because if you purchase 5 electronic books, you have to purchase 5 licenses for those electronic books. And then those licenses travel with the book. They cannot be exchanged, they are not fungible, they cannot be transferred, they refer just to that book. So essentially, even though it's an ebook, it functions exactly like a physical book, 1 license per book. And those are some of the issues, I think, that come in the way of an easier access to non-academics to some of these mobile and digital archives.
Yeah, it's a conversation we've been having this week here, because of these problems that we've been discussing, is that you know, people still in the humanities, they have to do their dissertation, they have to write these books and publish the books. Is that the difference between publishing a digital version of a book, an ebook, and writing what we're calling book companions. So one of the possibilities that we're exploring is, of course, it's like you write your book that people require you, right? And the publishers will handle that, and the creation of these problematic ebooks will happen. But you do this side work where you actually don't use the specialist language, and you offer the archive of your source materials for people to access with a narrative that is accessible to the public. So this is something we're doing for several of the books here that are being worked on right now. Which we think we're going to explore this avenue, because I think this is this might be a good way to reach the public. And of course, we do this in a way that with the mobile, obviously, if you want to reach public, you have to reach with the mobile. But without this problem of the licensing or anything like this, because this part, then we do completely open access, right? And it's not copyright restrictions because the book is owned by the press, but not this. So this we can develop here. Part of the problem is, of course, not everybody knows how to develop these digital archives, and you need that technological know-how, but I think that might also be something worth exploring for everybody. Really quickly, though, it's important to something I teach a lot in the Caribbean is I teach students and scholars there to use the pirate libraries. It's important. I've even had this conversation with the president of my country, where I encourage the president to try to pass a law where my country will not respect international copyright law. There are precedents in other countries, like Nehru in India after independence. They did the same thing, and India now has medicines. It's not only books. It's like they have access to so much knowledge because they decided that they were going to have a different relationship to international copyright law. I understand that governments, neoliberalism pressures governments into signing into these things in order to so that they can have better trade agreements and these kinds of things. But it's worth considering for our societies that we might find a space for us to develop our own knowledge infrastructure outside of this system of licensing that seems to be monetarily benefiting only the North Atlantic world. We do not seem to be monetarily benefiting from these ways of exchanging knowledge. So that's something for the audience to consider.
Thank you so much. There is a question, and I think this is very open also to the initiative of African DH, which is what plans to train young African scholars interested in DH within the African continent?
Can you repeat the question? I was drinking water, sorry.
Yes, absolutely. It's about what plans to train young African scholars interested in digital humanities within the African continent.
Alex, do you want to take that one? Or should I go?
I know what's happening in the Caribbean. We're designing certificate programs, degree programs. We're designing summer institutes. There's already a lot of activity, Create Caribbean, and other centers like it. That was just the first one, and there's many other places where we are trying to train young people in different environments as much as we can, because the students are pressured by material realities away from the work of a cultural patrimony, right? So we're doing what we can.
Okay, so again, in South Africa, we have a long tradition of teaching library science. And so now there's already a conversation about how that degree or those degrees in library science can be converted into new degrees in digital archival management. But for those of you who are interested, there's a very interesting project at the University of Cape Town called Archives and Public Culture, where actually not only have they developed an online resource for example, I've handed my archival material that I used for my first book, what Alex was talking about, to the Archives and Public Culture to put those online next to the archival material about the topic that I wrote about. So essentially, we're going to be creating a curated project on the archives and on the original author that I wrote about for archives and public culture. And also, I think, as I say, library science itself is having to think about, or people who were once specialists in library science now have to think about how the degree can be updated. So that many young people who, and in South Africa, again, it's very bizarre, but most people who study library science study it because they want to be teachers. And so many universities, library studies and library sciences under the education faculty or the education department. So how can you make that into a much more general degree where someone who's an engineer or who's a computer programmer can also participate? And then I think the other aspect of training is this idea that, and again, these ideas have come up because of the pandemic is how universities are beginning to release courses, MOOCs as they're called, that are small packaged courses that have to do with digitization and information technology, where you don't need to study an entire degree, but you can study a course at a time in order to keep your skills upgraded. So many South African universities are already looking at how they can release those types of small packaged courses rather than essentially asking someone to commit to an entire degree. And I think it would deal with the issue that Alex was talking about, you know, that students are looking at how much does it cost to study an entire degree in digitization. The other part is that Witss has now a special school of animation and digital technology, and even has a festival every year of animation and digital technology, sponsored by IBM. And so I think it's also about getting private and philanthropic organizations to start sponsoring these centers that are actually giving respectability and viability and sustainability to careers in technology, animation, and digital programming.
Yeah, if I can add really quick, what my dream would be for my people in the Caribbean, I mentioned that already, but I hope that we start training in the intersection of library science and the humanities, not the one or the other, because these two, the way these two separate from each other, actually will not allow our young people to develop the skills, I think, that they will need to what I refer to become warriors against the problems that are going to come in the 21st century that are already here. So for me, a digital, like, this is part of like also how I think about digital humanities. You see, the Digital Library of the Caribbean created this large database of digitized material. It is a very well done collection of digital artifacts. One of the largest in the world of its kind, that takes a whole region by making partners with so many nations, created this massive database. But again, you can only browse and search it. Now, the people who work in this project, they're my colleagues and friends, and I talk to them, and they understand now that the fact that they developed this like this for 50 years is very limiting. And they wish now that they would have developed this with a view to all the things that you can do. The stories you can tell is very important. So this is what we differentiate between, for example, a digital collection and a digital exhibit. The digital exhibit takes a collection but tells a story with it. And this is the part where people outside of libraries get trained in, right? This is the part where scholars get trained in being able to synthesize, to analyze historical artifacts and form concepts and tell stories with this. If we train people in both, this is my dream, that we train people in both, I think we will be better prepared in the 21st century. One of the things that is going to happen in the 21st century because of the rise of machine learning, of what some people call artificial intelligence, is that falsification of the past becomes easier. So that this distrust that people have of the vaccine that you were talking about, Hlonipha, this distrust is going to take over the scholarly world. Because the thing is that digital machine learning can create fake pictures of people in the 19th century. I can send you some links of some example of this, very well done. It can create new text. So students will be submitting essays they didn't write. All of these things will start happening. The historical record will become corrupt in new ways with this kind of methods. If we train people, not only to build digital archives, but to harness the technological tools that allow us to manipulate that archive, they will be better prepared also as scholars, as future scholars, to respond to this kind of corruption that is going to come, and to fight better with this kind of distrust at the same time. So that's my dream, that we do both, that we teach them in library science, but also within the departments.
Sylvia, before you wrap up, I'm wondering if I could just jump in. I know we don't have a lot of time anymore for this presentation. I am thinking about the difference between the conceptual and the material in terms of minimal computing and the infrastructural landscape across the continent. Alex, it's your work on minimal computing. How do we think about this in the African context? We're talking earlier about some aspect of the continent being very technologically sophisticated. So the exceptionality of South Africa, perhaps to some extent Nigeria, but there's still many other places where minimal computing could be really useful, right? I don't know what your thoughts might be on that.
The only project that I've worked myself on directly with a team in Africa was in Sudan. And most of the work that I did there was, I spent a week there working on this project with this historical archive of pictures of women from the post-independence movement, expressing the richness of women's dress and their subjectivity throughout the whole country. This archive went against the narrative of the government that says that a good Islamic woman must dress this particular way, right? So in order to do this archive that actually could exist within the university without actually creating unneeded attention and unneeded tension with the government, was to create a dual project using some of the same tools, the minimal computing tools that we're aware of, like the electricity, the bandwidth, and all these things. Creating a project that had dual pipeline, one for the internet, so the government can say, oh yeah, this project is nice, and one for the university itself, for the students, for teachers to use in the university. And the work was less technological and it was more social. What I needed to do there was actually get the engineers in the library to work with the historians so that they start talking to each other in a way they were not used to before. To think together about how to use these tools. Now, Joanna Walija just pointed out, it's very difficult to install this minimal computing in the end product, but to do it, you need, it's a lot of pain. You can ask Sylvia to actually be able to harness the fundamental tools of the computer. It's easy for the engineers though. So it was a social problem. It was getting these two constituencies together to start thinking of themselves as intellectual partners, not just the engineers being the people who help you solve the technological problems, but for them to both be invested in the project. So the future of these kind of developing our own technologies in the Caribbean or in Africa, I think depends on our ability to come together across disciplines and professions to be able to be part of the same project, and to foster new kinds of people and thinkers and doers who already integrate these domains. It'd be interesting to see what you think, Hlonipha, yeah.
I mean, for me, the real sort of example of minimal computing is what the entertainment industry does. So I think quite a lot of it also means that we have to learn from the entertainment industry, because the entertainment industry is so hungry for new customers that actually they're willing to introduce all sorts of software and programs that give people access to music, to films, etc., and with a very minimal footprint. And I think sometimes we, because as academics, we're not used to watching endless amounts of, in South Africa, amapiano videos and music, but many young people, that's how they understand the function of a computer, is through entertainment. And I think we also still need to start thinking about how our own desires may actually be best reflected in what the entertainment industry does, which is to get people hooked. I mean, you'll see young people in South Africa playing slot games on their phones, but then they won't be doing the same with knowledge, with reading, with archives. So if you made, to sort of make a joke, if you made archives more like a slot game, then you would have a lot of people accessing archival material and reading in the same way that they play computer games and music videos and playlists.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill and Dr. Mokeona for such a wonderful keynote dialogue. I think this gives us a lot to think and to put in practice within this South-to-South collaborations that you're just proposing. I will turn to the next panel, which it will start some minutes late, but I hope everyone can continue joining. This will be titled Meanings, Potentials, and Limitations of African Digital Humanities. Thank you.
Then we're starting the next panel immediately. I don't know if the moderator is here on the screen. Okay, Ignacio, take it away, please.
Okay, sounds good. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from. And welcome to this first panel in the second annual African Digital Humanities Symposium. My name is Ignacio Carvajal, and I am Assistant Professor of Latin American Literatures, Languages, and Cultures here at the University of Kansas. It is an honor for me to be the moderator today for this panel, which is entitled Meanings, Potentials, and Limitations of African Digital Humanities. Thank you to the organizers, to the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, and for the keynote speakers from whom we just heard a great intervention. And thank you, Dr. Yeku, for inviting me to host this panel. The way we're going to do it is that we will hear from each of our three speakers for about 15 minutes, and then we will have about 25 minutes to ask any questions that we might have or make any comments. I'll send presenters warnings of time via chat. And please, if you're an attendee, feel free to drop your questions or comments either as a comment in the chat or use the Q&A function that Zoom has. I will then pose the questions to the panelists during the discussion section. So the way that we'll do it is I'll introduce each of their speakers before the presentation, and then we'll go on to the next one and then have discussion. So our first speaker today is Emmanuel Ungwem, who is Associate Professor of Linguistics and Digital Humanities at the University of Yaoundé and is currently head of the Department of Cameroonian Languages and Cultures at the Higher Teacher Training College of Bertoua, University of Yaoundé in Cameroon. He is manager of the Archive, Languages, and Oral Resources of Africa, hosted by the International Center for Research and Documentation on Africa's Traditions and Languages, and is a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Humanities and Arts Computing. Welcome. His talk today is entitled Digital Humanities in African Low-Resourced Environments, Responsibilities, Lessons, and Opportunities.
Thank you, Ignacio. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, James, for making me part of this this event. I will start sharing my screen. Can you see my screen? No. Okay. Let me start it. So this is, and hopefully it works. Can you see it now? Hopefully.
Are you sure? Do you want to show block notes? Just block notes.
Okay. Okay. I would like Brian, if he's connected, to please share the presentation from his end, because I had anticipated that I could face this kind of problems. Let me try one last time.
Okay.
Can you see it? No?
Yes,
see your presentation
now.
Okay, can you see it now? Thank you. So let me start. I will try to share my reflections on the topic digital humanities in Africa, low resource environment, responsibilities, lessons, and opportunities. Yeah, this is a reflection that stems from my current experiences in a number of projects which I'm working on. The two most important of which are the organization of an event for French-speaking Africa in March. So I just shared the link to the website of the Institute. And another one is the editing of a special issue of the International Journal of Humanities and Art Computing, HIJAC. So these reflections may not, of course, be true for the whole of Africa. As you all know, Africa is a very diverse continent. Maybe they could hold mostly for the French-speaking part of Africa, and especially for Cameroon, where I'm based. So I think in Africa, more than in any part of the world, digital humanities mean different things to different people. And a concrete example is the experience with the program in digital humanities, which is being currently run at the National Advanced School of Engineering of the University of Yaoundé, where there is a program in digital humanities, but which does not include humanities. So this is a program only for engineering, etc. Yet it is called program in digital humanities. So different perceptions of what digital humanities are. And a second concrete experience is with my teaching at the University of Yaoundé, this time at the Faculty of Arts, where digital humanities is perceived as a completely new epistemology with new challenges, with more of a problem-solving approach than heuristics and hermeneutics perspective, which we as humanists are mostly used to. So these questions prompt me to reflect on the difficulties of the challenges, but not as challenges, but as a set of responsibilities, lessons, and opportunities. So this is what I'm going to talk in the next 10 minutes. So concerning the responsibilities, I mainly point to two types of responsibilities from the digital scholar, African digital scholar, the social responsibility and the scientific responsibility. Social responsibility here, for me, digital humanity provides, because it is geared towards problem solving, it really connects us to the meaningful existence of the people. So this raises new avenues of research, such as how can we connect language to well-being? By the way, I'm a linguist, so most of the examples and illustrations I'll be drawing stem from my experience as linguist. So how can we connect language to well-being, as opposed to just sticking to the structural, the systemic aspect of language, which is dominant currently in African linguistics? How do we tackle the power relationship in the public space? So one of the most pervasive presence of digitality in the public space is imaging. You know, images are being posted everywhere for various reasons. But how does these images reflect society? How do they account for the fair representation of minority communities who would very hardly find a hunter-gatherer being used for, you know, marketing purposes in some of the pictures that are shown. So to what extent this is of relevance to digital humanities scholarship? So now, moving on to scientific responsibility, I think we need to find a necessary trade-off between trending in technologies. And this goes very fast, you know, artificial intelligence, machine learning, but how do we stick to this trending while keeping the emotional engagement that humanity researcher needs to have? I I have an experience working in language documentation. Language documentation is about preserving endangered languages. And this is something that you need to, that connects you to the people, that engages you for a long term, as opposed to just having artificial intelligence and algorithm do everything like transcription, etc. So how do we blend these two trends in our scholarship? So another point is, how do we reflect the political life? How do we make sure that there's more participation in politics? How do we reflect on the business of politicians? Are we interested in working on the proceedings of like parliamentary proceedings or jurisdictional proceedings in Africa? Those are the topics that I scarcely encounter in our endeavor. So another point to me of importance is, how do we reflect diversity? Concerning multilingualism, it's the way grammar writing, the design of interfaces for database creation is mostly geared towards a monolingual mindset. How do we as African bring in a new narrative, a new perspective to interface design so as to make science or digital scholarship a more inclusive space for everyone? So I think now I'm going to move to the lessons. One lesson I've learned from my experience, from my personal experience, but also from the teaching of a few courses in digital humanities, is the appeal for what I call the fantasy of graphism. Once you are able to generate some kind of, fancy graphic, you feel like, yeah, I'm into this thing, I'm into digital humanities. Yet how does these graphics relate meaningfully to the knowledge, to the specific type of knowledge that you want to deliver? I think beyond the appeal of graphism, of algorithms, we need to understand, and I'm very happy that Gil made this very explicit, that it's very important that digital humanities should not just rely on technologies to do part of their work. They should be equipped to do both works. Now, I think we should learn to crawl before we walk, because if we stick to how fast, to the trending again, we may not be able to harness the painstaking enterprise of accumulating information. And this is something that happened in the West before the movement of digital humanities came in. Actually, as far as I know, it emerged from the need to make sense of existing data, especially text. And Farabusa is usually cited as one of the earlier proponents of this. So we should not skip these steps. We should try to preserve the hermeneutics of knowledge carpentry. I really use the term of carpentry as a humanly endeavor, humanly and painstaking, but at the same time an engaging in endeavor. So now opportunities. I think with this, there is a whole world of opportunities. For example, how can we republish the concept of the African juju? This is something that I take from Professor Frantic Nyamjo. The African juju is that realm, is an alternative reality. And we see all of these topics coming, you have metaverse and everything. So how can we, in our African representation of the world, capitalize on what is specific to us and which is now part of the global conversation about technological development? And this has been mentioned. How do we address the problem of low resource? And I think minimal computing, and this is something that has been mentioned several times during this symposium. I think, and this is a very important part of the training which we are going to offer in March. Tools like Raspberry Pi may just, be enough to do the kind of work that we want to do in Africa. So now I'm going to end with this thought. I think digital humanities is an invitation to humility. What do I mean by that? I think the problem with knowledge with the academia East Africa is that, and of course, as elsewhere, it's got the universities of the place. It's a place of power relationships, and most of us in the position of prestige, in the position of power, will not want to look how the world is changing and how we need to refurbish our conceptions about what knowledge is. And as long as we will not embrace this humility, I think the younger generation will not be ready to take off. So I think this is time, and digital humanity appeals us to deliver meaningful knowledge that talks to our society, as opposed to just being a game, an intellectual game, and perhaps most importantly, for recentering humanity scholarship towards the human condition, because I think that is all what humanities is all about. I think I'm going to stop there, and looking forward to the question and answers session that will come later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I love an invitation to humility. Please, if you have questions or comments, you can drop them in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we can come back to them at the end. Thank you for your presentation. Our next speaker is Caitlyn Tyler Richards, who is an editor at Michigan State University Press, where she acquires traditional and born digital projects in African, African American, and diaspora studies, as well as digital humanities. She is a PhD candidate in African history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is completing a born digital dissertation titled Onto the World, Producing, Distributing, and Consuming Nigerian Fiction After 1945. Tyler Richards discusses creating and analyzing a Nigerian fiction title database, an experience which forced her to confront the possibilities and limitations of using data and visualization tools to recenter African literary history. Her talk today is entitled Neither Feasts Nor Famine, Visualizing Nigerian Fiction Networks. Caitlyn Tyler Richards, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see. Do you see a slideshow, hopefully?
We see it.
Okay,
Yep.
Great. Then I'll get started. So as I said, thank you for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, etc. to everyone. As Ignacio said, my name is Caitlyn Tyler Richards, and today I'll be speaking briefly about my research on the history of Nigerian fiction and the potential limits of visualizing Nigerian fiction networks. I also wanted to thank James Yeku for giving me the opportunity to share my work, especially from a diaspora perspective, and to the KUIDRH for continuing to support this event and the development of African DH more generally. And then I am speaking to you from Salt Lake City, Utah, and so want to acknowledge that this land, which is named after the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. I recognize the historic and enduring relationship between Indigenous people and their ancestral territories, and honor the Indigenous stewards, past, present, and future of this land. All right. So the visualization work I'll be talking about today comes from my dissertation. Let's say the title one more time for fun. Onto the World, Producing, Circulating, and Consuming Fiction in Nigeria After 1945. It's a born digital dissertation in which I chart the changing modes and pathways of literary production, circulation, and consumption in Nigeria after World War II. I focus in particular on Nigerian authored prose fiction books, which allows me to put into conversation traditionally published novels like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart with market literature like Why Boys Don't Trust Their Girlfriends. When I first started this project, what feels like 4,000 years ago now, the animating question for me was, how have Nigerians participated in local and transnational literary networks since 1945? And why do they continue to do so, given the sort of international recognition Nigerian authors have even today, when faced with so many significant local and international born obstacles? A bit of context, as some of you may know, immediately following its independence in 1960, 4 of the world's 6 major publishers opened branches in Nigeria in order to capitalize on its rapidly expanding education sector. Longman and Heinemann in 1961, Oxford University Press in 1962, and Macmillan in 1965. Over the next 4 decades, these British-based publishing companies produced what we now recognize as the African literary canon. However, as many post-colonial and literary critics came to argue, by bringing African voices to a global audience in the 1960s and 70s, companies like Heinemann established themselves as the arbiters of African literature and ultimately skewed the canon towards Western readers' tastes. Furthermore, their monopoly on African markets limited the development of local publishing industries and reading cultures, ensuring that literacy rates would plummet in the early 1980s when world economic depression led several companies to shut down their African-based branches. Therefore, while African authors continued and continue to find opportunities abroad, African countries entered into what publisher James Curry hauntingly described as the book famine. While illuminating the inequities in international publishing and the disconnect between the post-colonial canon and African literary habits, I argue that in the case of Nigeria, this quote-unquote cultural imperialist narrative that dominates African literary historiography obscures more complex literary circuits and Nigerians' roles within them. It doesn't really leave space to engage with the Nigerians who, for example, worked for British institutions as editors, translators, and printers, or Nigerians who came up with alternative forms of fiction like Onisha pamphlets and Kano market romances. With my dissertation, I map, often literally, the production, circulation, and consumption of these latter texts along with more traditional British circuits to show how Nigeria has in fact played host to local and transnational literary networks. Following these networks has provided me a fuller sense of the forms and meanings of Nigeria that Nigerian fiction has taken, as well as related activities like reading, writing, and publishing. Ultimately, I aim to demonstrate that due to its unique local and transnational history and the way that those two histories intersect, over time, the fiction book, and I really am most interested in the book itself as an object, has become a vector through which the Nigerian state and individuals could literally and metaphorically place themselves in the world. And so onto the actual project. I have always planned to do this as a born digital dissertation, but I must confess that my original proposal, I pitched onto the world as an African history project that just would have some digital tools and visualization components because I had some sense of how to do it and I thought it would be fun. But now, due to both the evolution of my own thinking, I hope, and the growth around the expanding conversation around African DH, I really come to think of this as an African DH project. And here on the screen, you can see the sort of landing page for my project as it currently exists. And so what I mean when I say thinking of this more as an African DH project, I find that engaging more intentionally with DH and wrestling with how African DH might distinguish itself hasn't necessarily changed the tools that I use, but it has made me more thoughtful about the ways in which I use them. As I've discussed elsewhere, my sense of an African DH approach, specifically from a US diaspora, Black diaspora perspective, draws guidance from Kim Gallen's emphasis in making a case for Black digital humanities on recovering alternate constructions of humanity, and Rafika Rissom's call to remake the worlds instantiated in the digital cultural record. And then also, as both Gallen and Rissom argue, I want to pay attention to the need to recognize the inequities entrenched in the sources I study and the tools that I use to study them. And with that in mind, I have become especially concerned with the issue of visualization. On one hand, I think this is a natural progression of the project, given that my initial design approach was to diversify people's image of Nigerian fiction by throwing as many book covers and maps at them as possible. However, I think my anxiety also around visualization also reflects an ongoing tension in the study of Africa from the North or West, or what have you, more broadly. In her 2019 article for The Republic, Bolu Atife Akinro writes, In the global context of looking, Africa has not been granted equal status. We stand apart as the other, stared at, looked down upon, and most times lacking the vantage point to return the gaze. She's writing with regards to Western media, including photography, book covers, and blockbuster films, but I think it's easy to see that this dynamic can also exist, that this dynamic does exist in African studies and could exist in DH as well. And so in the second half of my talk, I want to talk very quickly about the three ways in which my dissertation visualizes Nigerian fiction, fiction networks, and my effort to quote unquote grant Africa equal status in how I choose and construct those visuals. So the first level, if you will, is the website, basically the website landing page. I just want to give you a brief description of the website. It's built on Omeka. It has a main exhibit, which consists of 4 essays, roughly the equivalent to 4 chapters that covers the history of Nigerian fiction from the 1940s up to the present. There are also 8 short exhibits on key objects or ideas, such as the Gaskia Corporation and the role of prizes in developing the concept of Nigerian fiction. There are also 4 collections of books that correspond to the main exhibit essays that I'll talk a little bit about in the next slide. And then there will also be an essay to contextualize my project in the very networks that I've just identified. It's very meta. Okay, and so here is the landing page. And I already showed you earlier the image on the top left, which is from a reading room in Enugu in the 1950s. And that originally was the main image I used for the landing page because I felt that it most directly challenged the preconceived notions about Nigerian literary culture. Here is a picture of Nigerians reading that can't be disputed. However, upon further reflection, I've decided to include additional images that cycle through as you refresh the page that captures a fuller scope of Nigerians' engagement with books. Including a photograph from 2017 that I took of Casaba's bookshop in Abuja and of a bookseller's sort of self-designed warehouse in Enugu, again from 2017. And more specifically, I decided to include the warehouse photograph because while it may reinforce some people's preconceived notions of books in Africa or Africa more generally, it also tells us something very important about Nigeria's current position in the global book chain, specifically as a dumping ground for quote unquote donations from the US. And I don't think that's something that should be ignored, especially if it sort of allows the US to continue to feel good about all those books we donate to libraries. Okay, and so the second way in which I visualize Nigerian fiction is through the aforementioned title collections. And so, as I said, there are 4 collections. They cover about 2 decades each. So the one I have up on screen is the 1940s to 50s. At the top of each collection is a bit of a description. The first paragraph situates the collection within a larger Nigerian literary history. And then the second paragraph, which doesn't appear on screen, highlights major actors and forms, which I often turn into tags. So for example, you can search within these collections just Onisha pamphlets or just Kano market romances. All items are also tagged by language and location of contributor. And so on one hand, I feel like this is one of the biggest contributions my project makes to expanding our understanding of Nigerian fiction, because it literally helps document the variety of forms that Nigerian fiction has taken. However, as I populate the collections, I'm realizing there's still an imbalance due to the history of archives and my positionality as a US researcher, which is to say, I'm finding that I can provide more information and often images for traditionally published and or traditionally published books and or texts that have been stored in global North archives, including cover images, publication information, as I said. And this leads them to being more visible in the collection. And I've tried to offset this effect by including a note at the beginning of the collection that makes clear that this collection is not represented. It's that this collection is representative, not comprehensive, but I would welcome any other thoughts on how I might be able to address this visual imbalance. And then here's just an item, a close-up of an individual item. And here is the ugly, ugly database that backs everything up. And so finally, I have data visualizations within individual chapters. These visualizations draw from the aforementioned data set that I just showed, as well as interviews, archival records from the US, UK, and Nigeria, as well as published primary and secondary sources, including the books themselves that I've found in US, Nigerian, and UK libraries. So originally, when designing data visualizations, my main goal was to, again, challenge the idea of Nigeria being empty of any literary items, institutions, activities before and after the arrival of British publishers. So for example, the map on the left shows reading rooms in Northern Nigeria active in the late 1940s and 1950s. And I think it's just really important, the number of reading rooms that there actually were at this time. However, much like with the landing page banner, I realized that this did not give a full or realistic sense of Nigerians' experiences with fiction. In order to communicate that experience, I would have to start visualizing the instances in which literary networks fail. And so the map on the right pulls from exchanges between African Writer Series editors and authors in the 1960s and 70s. The green dots that are filled in indicate where books are available. The green circles indicate where books were recently sold out. The filled dots indicate where books have yet to arrive. And the red circles indicate where books are out of stock. And this map is very much in progress, but my goal is to eventually communicate the sense with which authors anticipated books, many of which did not arrive. There was a real sense of demand that was unmet because of the nature of literary networks at the time. And so to conclude, these are just a few ways in which I've been handling the tension around visualization within African DH from a diaspora approach. To summarize, by creating or foregrounding visuals that privilege individual Nigerian experiences, visuals that capture the full scope of Nigerian experiences, not necessarily hiding the inequities that have been experienced or privileging the triumphs, and by noting where possible the limits of my own perspective and research. And so I thank you for your time. I welcome any questions or comments, and especially recommendations for readings on the politics of data visualizations, or thoughts about how I might better portray the history that I'd like to share with everyone. So thank you.
Thank you so very much for that wonderful presentation. There is quite a bit of excitement and question that I'll make sure to bring out during our Q&A in the chat. So feel free to look through that. And I will say again, for those of you who are joining us, comments and questions, compliments are welcome in the chat as we listen. Our final presenter today is Augustine Farinola, who is a literary and cultural critic who specializes in the use of philosophical theories and computational approaches to textual analysis of literary corpus. He specializes in the use of data-based and algorithm-powered methods in exploring the intersection between themes that cut across 20th century Western and African philosophy and literature. He is also interested in contemporary computational methods, including machine learning, named entity recognition, semantic data, topic modeling, and various textual analysis technologies in the digital humanities. He is a PhD researcher at the University of Birmingham and currently chair of the board of directors of the African Researchers Network in the United Kingdom. Augustine's talk today is entitled The Question of African Agency in DH Practices. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I share my slides now. So the title of the presentation is a sort of presented in form of dialectics or a form of rhetorical, trying to ask where the roles the Africans are playing in DH practices globally. And what I did here is, first of all, to mine the corpus, the Digital Humanities Quarterly from 2007 to 2021, and use that text, first of all, to generate some kind of a model to locate places that were actually mentioned and context in which they mentioned them. And as you can see that, you know, most of those places, instances in which African has been mentioned, is either they are referring to somebody who once worked or lived or passed by Africa. And hardly do we have African publishers having their work on those, on DH Quarterly journal. There are other journals, but this is the one that is open source that I could play with a corpus. And the question that now comes to my mind is, yes, we know that there is African digital humanities, and we know people who have associated themselves or who say they are Africans that are doing digital humanities. But what do we mean by attaching the appendix African to that concept? You know, what we mean when we say African digital humanities or British digital humanities or Caribbean digital humanities. And for me, I can't speak to all aspects of digital humanities, but I'm only based working in the area of textual analysis or text-based scholarship in the digital humanities. And from text-based scholarship, this schema shows the basic things that have been put in place in the digital humanities practices in Europe, in America, and all the places. So we have the government and industries digitizing books. We have the institutions, having departments, organizations, publication networks, and most of all these, you know, are framed around discourses or existing what we can say literary heritage that belongs to Europe, or literary heritage that belongs to America. And if myself, I'm doing digital humanities research in the UK, I'll be working on something like Shakespeare, or working from Echo repository, or working on some of all this. And can we say that is African digital humanities? That's still open, or is it because I'm an African, or is it someone else can also embark on, or what is actually digital humanities? And you know, we know that effort is currently being made, as most of the late speakers have spoken, in documenting, in trying to get repositories and trying to put some of this data infrastructure. But does that still serve as the African digital humanities? And is our role only meant to just set stage and to document things and to have all these archives? You know, is that all about, and does that bring us into the forefront, or bring our research into the, or bring our research into some of the existing publication platform, or what we can say, people who are making productive knowledge production in the digital humanities scholarship? And what I have here is to go back to the schema of what we can say the computer-assisted text analysis, which I say that's my own area of specialization. I found that what I've developed as someone who is a student or a researcher in that aspect of digital humanities is that I have the two methods that I've learned, which the method irrespective of who is using them. And we have theories too, which can be borrowed irrespective of who composed the theories or whatever, which are part, and then the practices, which is data-based and algorithm-driven. And then we have tools as well as programming languages. You know, most of all these things at the onset of my own personal research in digital humanities, I question them. I try to question them, like, why should we use some of these tools? Why shouldn't we use certain methods that are African or whatever? But we know that humanities exist as African. We have African philosophy, African literature, African all this, just as we have other forms of fields in the humanities, even before digital humanities pick up as a field of its own. But what we know that what ties all of us together will be methods and as well as approaches, as well as what we come out with, but the data will varies. And that's when I see African digital humanities. I see most of all, whatever we call digital humanities or have been associated with digital humanities in every part of the world to be found within this geographical space called Africa, and people who are making research on data as well as issues that affect this region can actually be called African digital humanists. And then back to the question of African agency. You know, this was actually generated from, I mined a lot of freely available digital humanities textbooks online, and I try to layer them. You know, these are books talking about, and then you will see that, you know, the places in which we can say are mentioned, because what I do more is text and map, which is spatial analysis, and you will see this whole idea of the agency is still lacking. Even though we can have political kind of a thing and say, yeah, we are doing well, or the digital humanities is moving and all this stuff. So, hello, I think my slide stopped sharing. Hello?
Yeah, we hear you, we see you, but we have lost your slides. So if you sharing
all of a sudden the slide stop just went off. So I'll just bring that up again.
Okay.
What I'll be speaking to where I stopped with regards to the agency, that it's obvious that we are currently doing serious works. A lot of leading scholars are doing a lot of things on documentations. But what we're talking about is the research content and how those research content will be Africa. And that's when we can have the question, the whole idea of being visible within the whole global space. So if the slide doesn't come up, I will just keep speaking to the paper from my head. Because how many minutes, please, do I have left?
You still have 9 more minutes.
Okay. So from the am I sharing it now, right? Can you see it now? It just got me off band. Yeah. So back to where we were before that tripped off. So the whole thing comes back to the knowledge, developing new tools. Like when I said when I questioned some of this in the past, I was more preoccupied with developing tools based on African knowledge systems and ontology, and responding to some of the restraints. And the second digital humanities summer school, which was organized in Nigeria and a lot of people from other African countries, I conducted a survey to look at what are the tools that people are using and how has that really engaged with their data. And a lot of reports about distortion, about linguistic restraints and all this stuff. And this publication, I work with an expert in African studies to look at how we can develop indigenous models of communication for software development, so that some of these theories, like, you know, which like from emoticons, from linguistic understanding and other forms, can actually be brought up in such a way that it will be able to interpret the research of most of the scholars, and they won't have all these restraints. And I still subscribe to the idea of amending or using the existing ones. And in this particular research where I was trying to use a Voyant tool as well as a Python LLP to engage with corpus developed from African, literatures that were written in the African language and African language Yoruba. And one of the things I did was to do some manipulations to the tool, like using Voyant to doing some forms of stop words, to use improvising and trying to adapt it to be able to get some kind of comparative analysis and to be able to get some visualization as well as some form of tokenizations and all these other things that we actually do on English or non-African based text. in this particular research, what I did was to use Recogito to try to rediscover spaces and texts in Africa, and which is one of the tools, and use ways in which when we have some of these existing maps, can we create the reality that we have and layer them and use QGIS, some of the other things, and rasterize and layer them and still be able to get the results. So what I'm not describing this research, the outputs are out there and already in various forms. But the way I'm trying to bring up is that some of the existing tools can still be manipulated, can still be played with and be used to achieve whatever. Like for instance, now with Recogito, using the NLP that is there, use it first of all to generate places and names. And some of the names might not be accurate because it may not know some of the African names, which I was able to correct. And what I'm trying to bring all out is we can still engage with some of our own data in their linguistic form or whatever form they are, using the existing tools, if new tools are not made or put in place. I'll be very fast to talk about my current project, which I titled An African Computational Phenomenological Hermeneutics. What I mean by phenomenological hermeneutics is dealing with African phenomenon and going to the resource of African knowledge production. And if we talk about phenomena, we talk about text, images, and sounds. And the author in this context are the charts and the tweets and the comments. And a lot of people have said, why do you want to take all those things seriously? But from the epistemological point of view, I see those charts as expressions of one's opinion based on one's belief, which can either be true or false. Then it's the duty of an analyst to be able to engage with that. But a corporal and a knowledge-based framework can also, or representation can be developed from there. And I see to some of those beliefs are authentic, even more than some of the claims that people who are not on ground or people whose work are published, or assertions and claims and generalizations that people who are experts on Africa are making without even being on ground or having in touch with the people. So I look at this, the publishers in this case will be the social media, because that's our whole, what we can say, the digital village square. We have always ancestors, the African ancestors have always been the village square. The village square is for old people, for young people, for the women to play, to talk, and to discuss, to brainstorm. And this village square is now in the digital space. And we all know that if we look at the global population and the digital and the presence, global presence on the internet, we know that most of the users of all these existing social media are the majority are Africans. Even if you look at this analysis I did from data I got from statistical, you will see that the 9% out of the global, the rest of the world, African constitute the 9% of Facebook user. And we know that the world population, Africa is 17.5% of the world population. So what we're trying to say is that it's not like they're not digitally conscious. It's not like they're not speaking. It's not like the knowledge cannot be produced, but how do we go back to the village square and get ideas and knowledge in which people are producing and not just see them as mere tweets? And the other place we have been developing corporate is always the online newspapers, which we have numerous of them and which can be scrapped and you can do that easily. You can use what we call it, tools, or you can use simple algorithm that you can even copy online and be able to generate. And what we make from that is that's just being done for the sake of doing that. There are a lot of interesting things that are revealed from charts and communication, which can contribute to issues that we discuss in respective disciplines in the humanities, which are African-based. And that's why I still call it a phenomenological base, dealing with the phenomena and dealing with the people that are on ground with it. And I won't be able to speak so much about this, but here are some of the patterns I generated from charts of popular music. You will see some of, if you mind, for instance, Yemi Alade's, most of our YouTube channels, you will see that some of the conversations that are going on, and when you compare the pattern with other artists, and what are people talking about? What are they talking about in Africa? What has it got to do with Europe? Like, for instance, now, they were talking like this, a collection, a corpus from the charts on Boko Haram. And then Britain is always at the forefront of everything that they're talking, the whole thing kept going back to Britain. So what, to conclude, I would say that the African digital humanities can be authentically African on the grounds that we allow our visibility first. And some people may say it's political, maybe if it does not sound like what the publisher wants to, or what the big digital humanities journals are publishing. When you send your papers to them, maybe they don't know what you're talking about, or the corpora, or the topic here. So they may accept papers or digital humanities work that fall within the range of issues, phenomena around Europe and America. Well, what we can do is we can still think along with our corporas, with our existing tools, and create platform. Our relevance will be apparent to the general academic community in Africa when we deploy computational tools. And that will make digital humanities more evident within the scholarship. They will be able to know what they do close within and other forms to do. We play parts, we work together as a team and reveal or unveil some of those things that computational activities can bring forward. And to promote diversity and a global framework for digital humanities scholarship, Africa's rich multilingual and multicultural knowledge system and phenomenon must constitute the bedrock of textual, visual, and audio corporas that we engage with. And this is to the global, or those people are stakeholders in global conversation in digital humanities. They need to take this serious, or else it will just be like playing lip service to Black Lives Matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for discussion and question. And I think that we have plenty to talk about. There's been a lot of questions and comments in the chat. I'll go over a couple of them because I think affirmations is important. So I'm gonna read a couple of the ones that people have dropped in the chat. Excellent presentation, Emmanuel. Your idea that digital humanity is an invitation to humility is so appealing to me. The painstaking steps in DH absolutely require that we start by doing the right things that are meaningful, not only to us, but to our communities, which I feel like is a topic that runs through everybody's presentation. Caitlyn, folks were saying that they can't wait to read your dissertation, and yes, wait to lead the way. They're wondering about your metadata and how you convinced your committee to let you write a completely digital dissertation, which is, I think, is an interesting. And then Augustine, thank you so much for doing this work. So helpful to know where we are as we work on where we want to go. I love Augustine's expansive imagination. Nothing is out of bounds to his study. And the number of tools, methods, and projects you're sharing is blowing my mind. So yeah, it's been an honor for me to get to sit in and sort of moderate this panel. I think I'll put two of the main concerns I think that have come up and then give y'all an opportunity to speak so we can hear more from y'all. And I think one of them is whether we are simply applying something that you said, Augustine, which was, why do you want to pay attention to that? Or something like that. I think it's sort of, why do you want to take those things seriously is the way that you framed it. And I think that's a question that in DH and in sort of non-canonical objects of study or ways of study folks get. And so I think that that sort of put together with for whom, right? And using whose tools, which is a big question. And so if any of you three want to speak about, Emmanuel, you called that the social responsibility and the scientific responsibility. We could call that like tokenism and what inclusions are into projects and what other exclusions are into those projects, or to be very specific, whose methodologies is it that you're using, right? And then the other sort of column of a question that I think I saw was folks being interested in the way that you are working with y'all's metadata as you sort of organize your projects to become functional. So I'll toss those two sort of questions out. If folks have more questions in the chat, please go ahead and drop them. If you have questions for each other, please, by all means, and we can start there. I don't know if somebody wants to go first to speak to any of that.
Yeah, I think there's a question here, which somebody said for Augustine, your scope is impressively wide. I would enjoy hearing more about how you went about approaching this project in terms of data collection and analysis. And for me as a person, I get free books online. There are free PDF books, and some of them may not be what we call it. May not be legal, as some people will say, but the law allows for educational purposes and for private users. And there are also, so when we talk about, and there are also websites that, like the DHQ, for instance, the API is allowed, the data is already being collected in XML format. So when I get that, I transform them to whatever format I want to engage with, and use whatever tool, whatever I want to use with. And but there's one aspect. The other aspect is social media. It's not difficult to get from Facebook, for instance. I don't know whatever law you put in place, but once you're able to get your back-end developer side, the same thing with the Twitter, you can be able to reference that in a Python code and be able to get that. And there are some existing algorithms on people's GitHub. So you can see some scholars who are already involved in web scrubbing and all these things. So you can just go to that, follow that, and all you need is basic understanding of Python's function classes, so that when you want to just do some alteration, at least to be able to get the whatever you do back to your system, and to be able to also, and then you can spend time to develop yours as it favors you. So that's how I work with corporas developed from books, as well as those ones scrapped from online resources.
Going back to the question or comment that you had, Ignacio, about this, I see a thread of, I think what Emmanuel called social responsibility of African DH. And I think what I'm really grappling with is that I feel like the responsibility is different depending on whether you're African or part of the diaspora. And then, but in saying that, I'm not sure whether I include like Africans who are working at like Western universities as part of the diaspora there. But anyway, I would be interested to hear from Augustine and Emmanuel if you feel like scholars like me have a different type of social responsibility. If there's something you like wish that we did better or differently, not to put you on the spot, but yeah, I don't know.
Caitlyn, a lot of people who have African descent are doing a lot of wonderful works, and I've been following that up. There is even a repository that, a kind of a collection that was done by this lady, I've forgotten her name, which is collecting all projects, digital humanity projects developed by people of African descent and all others, and creating, and you know, there's a link, because what if you look at it in the book, the Digital Black Atlantic, for instance, most of the things the scholars here have talked about is the rediscovery. And the rediscovery is part of what both the Africans in the continent and the Africans in the diaspora are doing. When we discover the wealth of knowledge and the wealth of history, religion, philosophy that existed in the 15th and prior to colonialism and slavery, then it gives us a bulk of data and resources that we can call our own. And the same thing which the African Americans are doing. What happened in the plantations? What happened to our generations, and a lot of other intelligence work. So we are together, and that's why I really love when we use, you know, when people use black, it's like, oh, well, I'm black in diaspora, I'm black in the UK, but I'm actually African. And then we know that we're all together as people of African descent. So we are together like two sides of the coin, trying to achieve the same goal of bringing forth knowledge, what has been the lost glory of the Africans. So Caitlyn, you're doing a great job.
All I was looking for was validation.
I would like to say something if Ignacio would allow me. Please. So yeah, thank you, Augustine and Caitlyn. Personally, I'm a little bit kind of not very comfortable with the idea of not only in digital humanities, but in the whole enterprise of science and knowledge. The idea of making African an object in its own right, objectification of Africa. I mean, this has been going on for decades, and this has not changed the trend of the world. So this may have very pervasive, very negative effects on us. If we start looking at us as different, well, of course we may be different, but I think what is important is try to get the understanding of the global picture and seeing contextually how this can be applied, and if it cannot be applied, how can we inform the global village? Of course, I feel, of course, I'm based in Africa, but how that are engineered in the Silicon Valleys, suffuse my life, whether I like it or not. So, yeah, this is a worry and something that I wanted to voice out and share with you.
I think I agree with you, Emmanuel, that this whole idea of being placed on our toes to perform, and it still reciprocates, so what I can say, a post-colonial mental, or what we can say psychic damage, in which you're being trained, make sure everything you're doing appeals to the global, to the Western society and European society. And I've tried that. But whatever you do, an indigenous person, when I work on Heidegger, a German young scholar like myself would do the same thing and be more acceptable. And there are lots of knowledge systems that it goes beyond just classroom. We were brought up in this. It's a language, it's a word, we can represent that. But if we're going to, the whole thing is that if we're going to respond to the themes, to the issues, to whatever, it's like we are forcing our own realities into the framework that has been created. And the two things that will happen is we will not be relevant in Africa, because whatever we are doing, nobody will read it, because it does not appeal to them or make sense. And we will not be relevant in the diaspora because it's the second best of what could actually be the best. So for me as a person, I'm not interested just in making a project to fit into a grant. I'm not interested in doing something that portrays originality. And the trend is going backward, in which people are asking within a framework. When global scholars in digital humanities come out, they ask from your position or positionality, what are you bringing forward? What are you bringing? And that is what we put pressure on. And I agree with you. But Silicon Valley is there doing its own, generating data, and need people to for its own. Do you know how much it costs for some of the existing tools that you can use to do web scraping? They are very expensive. If you do know how much it costs when you go on statistical to get data that are based on Africa that are there, they will sell it to you, monthly subscription and yearly subscription. But these are properties, these are hands, and that's why we need to just engage in this and develop this framework. I've submitted papers complaining about how global digital humanities has not shown consciousness to the dilemma and the complex nature of challenges we're facing in Africa. And some of the reviewers have replied, you can do that. Why don't you do that? People have told, go and do that. It's your own problem. So that is the truth. And that's what I think is relevant for us when we're having this conversation as African scholars or people of African descent. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may prompt, I'm looking at the last comment in the chat, and it says the relationship between what is evident in the archive and what lies between the lines, or only the traces of its absence, is different depending where you stand, by Dr. Gill. And I think that's interesting because I think it speaks a little bit to what you were mentioning earlier, Caitlyn, of here is the archive that I have access to, here are the things that are in that archive, and what can you make, how is it that you include other things? So my question that I would pose as we close out the panel would be, how would y'all speak to collaboration? Because as a person who comes into this space, and I see, for example, this type of meeting where you have folks in diaspora, folks in Africa talking about DH and what transformations there could be in the creation of the network or the sort of foundations of this is the type of new indigenous-based logics, right, that need to ground projects, right? How do you see the potential for that collaboration? And Dr. Yeku, if you want to jump in here, I mean, I think that something like this is part of that, of bringing folks to discuss those connections or lack thereof, right? And so how do you see either in your own projects or aspirationally, that collaboration serving your projects or your work, largely written.
If I could be completely honest, yeah, I definitely see the way I'm grappling with failure within the history of Nigerian fiction, aligning with the point that Dr. Gill brings up, but also in terms of collaboration. When I first set out with my project, I had all of these visions of bringing other people in, of having a function on the website to allow people to contribute different books so I could expand the archive. But the fact of the matter is I need to finish it. I'm only one person, and now I have another job. And so I think Dr. Gill had brought this up. There also are just like these realistic limitations on what we're able to do. And so I really appreciate spaces like this because this is what I have the energy and time for at this point. So here's hoping that someday we all get huge grants and can actually work together. But until then.
And if I might comment, I want to thank the Kansas State University as well as Dr. Yeku and the team for organizing this because it's so interesting. Listening to presentations from African and also the other part of the broader South perspective. And collaboration is necessary. Some people are doing the corpora, the repositories and working very hard to develop and do all this. Some people are at the other end trying to do the analysis. It would be good if they also try to enable us, I'm on the part of the analysis, they're able to expose us because I've tried to be part of what we say South African, they're doing a good job in South Africa on the linguistic and corpora, the same thing in Lagos. So, but the thing is that if we can mix some of our resources or whatever we are doing and make it available to each other or call upon each other, it will be greatly appreciated so that we contribute our skills in achieving our similar goals. And as Caitlyn has said, if we get grants for big projects, it will be good we're able to work together. So thank you once again for inviting me to this panel and for the wonderful things the other panelists have said.
Yeah, just one very short last word. Of course, collaboration is the key. Of course, collaboration is inescapable, but how can collaboration go if we don't think about being inclusive? And I think language is one of the most important issues to be able to address in this inclusivity, because as you can see, there are not, I mean, in this panel, we have been speaking English, which is great, which has come, but think about how many people could not attend this symposium only because of the language barrier. And Africa is a land, it's a space of diversity. And I think we definitely should engage into this conversation, into this challenge, so as not to raise colonialism that we have been blaming for such a long time. So thank you for this invitation. I'm very happy to meet with you all, and I hope we will keep in touch and continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Okay, we will bring there to a close this panel entitled Meanings, Potentials, and Limitations of African Digital Humanities. I want to please everybody, thank you in the chat and give a round of applause, at least some snapping or something, to Emmanuel Nguema, Augustine Farinola, and Caitlyn Tyler Richards for their beautiful presentations today, and best of luck with your projects and future endeavors. Dr. Yacou.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Ignacio. Thank you, Augustine Farinola and Caitlyn. I would say that, Emmanuel, your work is so important. Bringing this important Francophone context to what we're doing here is really amazing. I just also want to add something very quickly on the topic of collaboration. I've always insisted that back in Lagos, you have established tech hubs and guys doing so many great things. And the inability to draw from that communities is halting the development of, say, DH in a place like Lagos. So like Dr. Hill said earlier, the need to think about people at YABA as intellectual partners is something we need to take more seriously. And I imagine there are other, there are clusters all over the continent, from Nairobi to Accra and to Lagos. You have people, and Kaisola probably has experience in this, coming from that kind of environment. You know, people you can always partner with to do the kind of, digital labels we imagine can help the development of African DH. Having said that, I'll just, so maybe we'll take like a 5-minute break, and then Dr. Kwabena from the University of Ghana will get us started on the final panel for today. If people want to take a 5-minute break and be back by 12:35, that would be great. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It's been a great event. I've learned so much just listening to people, and hopefully we can get back together to continue by 12:35, just about 5 minutes.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this panel as we continue this wonderful and important symposium. And this panel is the second panel for the day. It's entitled African DH from the Diaspora, Connections and Collaborations. So as the theme suggests, we are going to be talking about the perspective of African digital humanities from the diaspora. We have 3 different panelists who are going to share their perspectives. So I will introduce them now, so that when the presentations start, they'll just be able to do it without any interruptions, as it were. And after they are done, there will be a time for questions, comments, and interactions, because this is not just a top-down panel. So as an audience member, you are welcome to share your questions in the Q&A or in the chat if you feel that is a more welcome place, and we'll be engaging them when all 3 are done. So I'll proceed to introduce each one. We are going to start with Shola Obayan. If I pronounce it wrong, forgive me. She's a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in digital humanities at MIT. She received her PhD in Africana Studies from Cornell University, and her research area or research areas lie in the intersections of Africana Studies, digital humanities, and science and technology studies. And more specifically, she's interested in the sociocultural implications of technology entrepreneurship in contemporary Africa, using Lagos, Nigeria's head point of departure. She's also the founder and executive director of a nonprofit organization called Orishun Collective Incorporated. Then we have Amabema Adrechua Bedu, who is a writer, teacher, and researcher based in New York. She comes from the best place in the world, Ghana, by the way. And her work often draws from her own history and contends with questions of borders, geography, and place, particularly for Afro-diasporic persons for whom nation-based location and belonging have historically been contended practices. She's the founder and director of the Global Poetics Project, which is GPP. It's a digital experimental archive, co-working space, and new media studio invested in developing resources, approaches, and tools for the study of poetry. She's also a Ford Foundation Dissertation Fellow and PhD candidate at Cornell University. And her dissertation examines the mediums Afro-diasporic words used to foster cross-national and cross-cultural solidarities throughout the Anglophone world. And we will end with Jennifer Kaika, if I pronounce it right. And she's an associate professor of ethnomusicology at the Eastman School of Music. And her ethnography of popular music in post-colonial Zimbabwe was published through Indiana University Press. This is African Expressive Culture Series in 2016. And she has a current project supported by an ACLS fellowship entitled Yacou's Stories. It's a born digital public humanities project that explores the musical life of the renowned Zimbabwean Imbira Zabajimbu player, oral historian and ritual specialist called Sekuru Tute Chigamba. And she has also received both Fulbright and Fulbright Hayes fellowships in support of her work. Similar to the other two presenters, she's also with a non-profit organization, Tariro, which she founded, and it educates teenage girls in Zimbabwean communities affected by HIV/AIDS. So this promises to be a very rich panel with diverse perspectives, and we look forward to hearing from them. So, Koyin Shodan, please, the floor is yours, as they say in Ghana.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Perfect.
Yes.
Can you see my slides? Perfect. You can see me too, right? You can see me too, right?
Everything is perfect.
Okay, good. I just want to be sure, you know, these days of Zoom. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much to all the organizers and everyone that has presented thus far. Dr. James Yacou, thank you so much for putting this together. Thank you to all the staff that has been helping. Thank you to Kansas, I believe Kansas State University. This has really been an enjoyable time just of scholarship and learning, and I've just learned so much from everyone that's presented thus far. Thank you so much. So my name is Koyin Sola Obayo, and I am actually, like you've heard already, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. And I'm going to be presenting on what I have entitled The Uncertain Place of Archives in African DH. So briefly, I kind of came into, I know Dr. Yacou was talking about a little bit about tech entrepreneurship and tech clusters in Lagos. I kind of came into DH through my dissertation research. I think I might have heard of DH, but I wasn't really too sure what it was all about. And which is why I really agree with what I think Dr. Gill said earlier about having a nexus whereby graduate students or students can do their work and their digital work, because it's a lot much more difficult trying to learn it after the fact, which is what I have had to do. So I'm a reluctant digital humanist to say that. And I came into my work studying on tech innovation and entrepreneurship in Nigeria, started studying on the ecosystem in Lagos. And as I was doing my field research there, ethnographic, I started exploring questions of what does this mean for the nation, nationalism? What does it mean for self-making? And that's just my work in general, but this is not really, this is a subset of my work. I'm not going into that. But I find DH to be useful personally because one, it has been useful as far as data analysis and achieving and arriving at better insights and just assessing, making it accessible to the people that I work with. I think that was actually a huge thing for me because I had so many interesting conversations with so many technologists in Lagos. And, you know, one of the things that came up not quite too often was this kind of extractionary relationship between researchers who come from the West, some white, some Black, that come and they just take this data and they don't have any access to it. So that's been something that I've been really trying to work against and change that narrative. And for the most part, they've been very supportive of this project, very supportive actually. The different people that I've met, giving me access to their networks and just trying to do as much as they can to further this. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. One thing I do want to also add is that DH, as we would all know, takes the shape of the institutional culture that it is entrenched in. And at MIT, that looks like a very heavy focus on building, engineering, because of CS. And I remember my first year, I'm a second year postdoc. My first year of my postdoc, I was thrown into this Python course from this MIT CS professor, and I was just like lost because it was too CS for me. And that actually piqued an interest, another interest on pedagogy, on how do we teach programming and to people who are not as engineering oriented or who are not, that's not that I can't do it, but that's not just what I do, but I still want to learn programming. So that's been a journey as well. So MIT is more so of the emphasis at the DH lab. What we do is that we're we're teaching engineering and CS students how to be more humanistic in their thinking, and some successes, but it's a journey, it's an ongoing journey. The lab is relatively new. So for my presentation, I'm going to be talking pretty much about this notion of the archives, which has been a theme that I've been hearing actually throughout all the other presentations. And I'm going to be talking about my own specific project that I'm currently working on building this digital archive on tech innovation in Lagos. Then I'm going to situate it within some of the questions that I'm currently grappling with. And then I'll talk a little bit more about where we are now, what we're doing, and what I've been learning from undertaking this enterprise. So the framing question that governs the work is, what is the relationship between African DH and the archive? And I'm going to approach this by way of a story. So this semester, we have a DH research group that normally meets maybe every other week, like twice a month or something like that. And we've been actually, our semester focuses on the archive. So there was a meeting where we had to read some articles. These are like my supervisors, different intellectuals, right? And DH particularly is also the technical director. And everybody was like, oh, is what Coin Solar building, is that an archive? And I'm just like, first of all, I was very uncomfortable because I'm the only Black person in that room, in that group. And I was just like, why am I being put on the spot? But it actually, as I was preparing for this presentation, I went back to that scene and I was thinking about what that means as far as DH practice for us as Africanists or African DH humanist or whatever you want to call it. And I was thinking about this notion of uncertainty and ambivalence being actually the right place to be when you're thinking about the archive, right? Because we all know that we can, although there's a huge debate on definitions, does this really constitute as an archive? Are we really following the archivist what's it called, protocols and best practices? We know that those things were constituted based on different regimes and structures of coloniality and racism and things like that. So I'm not really going to bother with that, although it's an important debate for some, right? But I'm more concerned with this notion of uncertainty in the work of archival work and practice. And I was thinking about that feeling of being uncomfortable and realizing that that actually must be the place where all archival work must be born from, right? There's a lot of uncertainty that governs the process. And I'm just kind of walking through and talking through my experience and what I've been going through as I've been building this archive. Is you have uncertainty in regards to form and content. Like, is what I'm building, what should this look like, right? What material should it hold? And a very important area of uncertainty is and thinking about authority, right? It's one of the things that makes the archive, or made the archive as it stood historically, was the ability to legitimate certain experiences over others. So it's that question is, how do we determine the legitimacy of what we're doing? What is it based on the number of materials that it's holding? Is it the institutional grants that it has been awarded? Or is it the professional profile of the project PI? And then there's this also interesting debate that we see also even within in-house, within like Black DH. Should it be more about digitizing, preserving cultural artifacts, or should we be more preoccupied with the materiality of those practices, labor and all that? So, but uncertainty, though, is a place where good DH work and good DH archival work must proceed from. And so when I reflect back on that question, the most important question then is not whether my project is an archive, but what does my project reveal about the archive? African digital archives are very important to the practice of African DH because they expose the truth about the archive, that they're fragmentary, they're nebulous, they're ephemeral, and they're almost always incomplete. They interrogate the logics that the technology, what I call the infrastructure. I think I loved what Alex Gill said earlier about the architectural I believe something of knowledge, that they expose that, they interrogate that structure and what is the materiality, what went into making this, right? And they also decenter this narrative, this singular narrative of this one version, this central narrative of history. So I believe that the African Digital Archive should be here to stay, and it's doing very important work. And especially for me, my work, right, is on this little known personal computer boom, or early history of computing in Lagos right now. That's what I'm working on. So I'm going to give you a brief overview on my project. Is called the Teco Archives. It's still in development. I don't have any things to show you yet because we're still working on it, but it's been a journey, and I'll talk about the journey. So this project seeks to address, the silence of African cultures within the global history of tech and computing by documenting and preserving the development of tech innovation and entrepreneurship in Lagos. When I first conceived of it, at the start of my last year, at the start of my postdoc, I was thinking it was going to be oh, I'm going to look at all the history. But when I started getting down to the reality of it, I was like, I don't have enough time, resources to do that. So let me narrow it down. So there are two phases of this project. The first phase of this project is focusing on, this is what I'm working on currently, on this early history of personal computing in Lagos, and which provides historical context to what is currently going on in Lagos. And then the next phase will be documenting the ongoing startup ecosystem. So for this first phase, which is the focus of this presentation, I've been looking at collecting newspapers, oral histories, different archival materials, conducting oral histories from those who were there, and videos and other relevant documents. Just a little bit about the process. It's been collaborative almost by necessity because it started during COVID, and my postdoc has been remote for the most part. So I've had to collaborate with people on the ground in Nigeria, collaborate with people in different archival locations, and conduct interviews via Zoom. I have had the opportunity to go in person to Lagos over the summer, but most of my interviews were done over Zoom. And then my local research assistant, Mr. Shola, has been so instrumental in helping me, and that's his picture, helping me get some newspaper archives, because there's no way we can even get into the CAC to look at company records and different things like that. IBM archive has been an interesting journey because they have some material, not so much, but they've been they've been difficult, but it's been interesting. And then the last bit would be local company archives, looking at these company archives and trying to get these entrepreneurs to cooperate. So a lot of them are older. So this is an older set of people. The oldest person I've interviewed has been 70, one of the first technology companies, JKK, in 1972. So there's so much that goes into this, and also culturally, so much that goes into that. And trying to get people to give you stuff, it's a lot. It's a lot of building trust, a lot of relationships. A lot of them have been very helpful and useful because, funny enough, I found out that a lot of them are actually writing books, and they're wanting to now pass on this legacy before obviously they transition. But so I've kind of come at this right time, trying to piece together this history and say, hey, this is what I'm doing, and I think it's good to preserve this history. And a lot of them have been cooperative. They've been cooperating, but it's still a journey. So where we are now, we're pretty much, the data collection is always going to be ongoing, but I think where we are, we're just going to go ahead and start building with what we have. We have a lot. I'll show you some of the materials, and then we've been transcribing interviews. The labor, the time that goes into that is long. Let me see, hope I'm not over time. Yeah, we've been transcribing interviews, we've been doing metadata creation, doing really all the nitty gritty. I'm fortunate to have some undergraduate research assistants to help me with that work, but it's still kind of a journey, and trying to align what this is actually going to look like, what resources is available to make this project come alive, right? And then the next phase would be the data curation and presentation, where we're going to use a lot of narrative storytelling, visualization, and mapping. So that would be the next phase. So I'm going to just show some of the materials that we've gathered, some old photos, some newspapers. Newspapers have been actually the biggest archival resource that we're drawing from now. This is from the Guardian Library, 1992, the early 90s, late 80s. Some pictures, those pictures are from actual, I think he was an entrepreneur from that era, Atlas computers in Surulere. And those are the things that we're working on currently, and trying to digitize, present this data, tell stories around this data, curate this information in a way that is useful and that will actually serve not only the community, but the larger global computing world. And then, so what's next? What's next is we're gonna finish data analysis and processing, and we're also going to be moving on to the curation and presentation of this data. We're gonna be doing that up until next spring, and we'll be done after that. So we hope that once we're done, this would actually, so I'm seeing it, conceiving of this more as an MVP, and once we're done, we would actually peak more community interest, because sometimes working with professionals from Nigeria, they're also a bit skeptical, like, okay, let's see what you have first, and then, we'll add more. So we'll see how that goes, but so far so good. It's been an interesting experience, and I look forward to talking more about it in the QA, and that's it for me. Oh, sorry, University of Kansas. Sorry, I apologize. Let me share.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And we can move straight to the next person. So Amma, please take over.
Great. Hi, everybody. I am going to quickly share my screen. I'll be moving back and forth between sharing the screen and not sharing it. So let's see. Can you all see this?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so my talk for today is titled The Big Data of Africa and the Diaspora and the Need for New Corpus. It's based on a short publication that I published through the Network for Digital Humanities in Africa website this past spring. My brief remarks for today will be divided into two parts. First, I'll speak at length about the development of Corpi for African Digital Humanities projects, something that I've been really thinking about and working through since about 2018. And then afterward, I'll talk a bit about how for the Global Poetics Project, which I'll also talk a little bit about, we have gone or moved from developing or kind of thinking about data as something that we're trying to collect and archive, and how we're trying to move into actually building things and analyzing and creating networks for these materials. So for part one, I'll just kind of hop into that. So in 2018, I started a project, and I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll share a different screen now. Great. So in 2018, I started the Global Poetics Project, which is a database of poetry. At a certain point, what became quite evident was that we were spending a lot of time amassing information, amassing data, but we wanted to begin thinking about moving beyond just cataloging this information, bringing it together and creating this sort of large and quite robust archive. So while seeing that there is a need to build a corpus, it also became quite clear that this project should begin taking the next step to analyzing this data and finding new ways of analyzing data about poetry of the global South. So I'll begin the talk by talking a bit about the data that we collected, about data in general, because I've been thinking about data as a term. And I'll be approaching this from my viewpoint as a person that works in literature, but also works comparatively. And just a little bit about the Global Poetics Project. It's an experimental archive, a co-working space, and a production studio invested in developing resources and tools for poetry. And it's housed within a larger project that I'm working on with some folks called Idea Incubator Labs, which I'm happy to talk about later as well. And I'll just share this quote here for us. Great. So I just want to read this aloud for us, and it's from the African Business Journal. So it's estimated that big data analytics will generate nearly $18 billion in cumulative revenues and $3.1 billion in revenue opportunities by 2028. The African data center market size is expected to cross 3 million by 2025. And the reason I'm reading this aloud for us is that very often when we're thinking about big data, or at least the people in this room might not think of it this way, but I think the general public, that when we think about big data, it often doesn't include things like the arts or the humanities, right? It's very often focusing on STEM-focused fields. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is to think about data from a humanistic perspective. So when thinking about the ways in which we can capture and engage with the big data of literary and cultural study, for those of us in DH, we know about Franco Moretti's statement that reading in and of itself will not do the job, perhaps. So in attempting to work with a large swath of Afro-diasporic poets in their literary productions, an interesting issue arose for me. What unit of analysis could be used to bring together a large corpus of texts and authors? Will the corpus be linguistically bound, geographically determined, based on aesthetics and form? Undoubtedly, any of these units would give heed to a method of comparison on very rigorous but still limited grounds. This question for me has become, how would I parse through the sort of 30,000 plus poets that are in the Global Poetics Project database? So we've developed this database. We developed it through archival research. We developed it through web scraping, but then we also developed it through just crowdsourcing. And we've been able to get people on board to help us build this database over the past couple of years. So the process of developing a corpus that is expansive and inclusive is a necessary task in the preservation of cultural productions, as well as the inclusion of them in future literary criticism. Again, the question begs to be asked, what is the unit of comparison that enables the development of a corpus? What warrants its inclusion in a data set? This question, more than being rooted in the digital humanities, remains a point of fruitful contention in the field of comparative literature. So David Damrosch, who has this wonderful book called What is World Literature, and has written extensively about world literature, kind of quotes another scholar saying, quote, "The unit of comparison is something that we really need to think about." Likewise, even here, a point made by Richard Borgson in a 1981 publication in Research in African Literatures troubles my thinking about comparison's relationship to the development of a corpus. As he writes, the mere fact that two things can be compared doesn't necessarily warrant their comparison, end quote. Yet what strikes me as interesting about the work of comparison that can be enabled through digital methodologies is that the development of an expansive and an inclusive corpus allows for the creation of new units of comparison created on the basis of a collection of a large number of literary and cultural products. So thinking about Franco Moretti again for distant reading, it would be a large grouping of literary or cultural texts, which enables the capture of varying trends in language, genre, style, topics, and more. So in the process of bringing together the literatures of a continent, or the literatures of, specifically for the Global Poetics Project, Afro-diasporic poets, poets of the Global South, and putting them all together, what ends up happening is that we have to find new ways of measuring relationality that might emerge for these poets. So for now, it's not just about collecting this information, but about finding new ways to analyze that information and new ways of trying to construct relationality or comparison. So as Teresa Martino noted in an article titled Research and Culture Through Big Data, she noted that the methods and approaches afforded to researchers through distant reading and cultural analytics enables, and I'm quoting from her here, an analysis of extensive corpora based on computing and may point to clues and trends that are significant for research into culture on condition that room is left for contextual knowledge, the ability to situate objects of study historically and sociologically, and discussion of the symbolic meanings of large amounts of artifacts and discourses, end quote. The study of the specificities of Africa or the African diaspora through the development of a corpus might make possible a new way of examining trends, relationships, and concepts that have emerged in the sort of longue durée of African literary history. So at this very moment, and I think this is something we've talked a lot about archiving today, and so I'm really glad to see that there are new data sets and new archives that people are creating. But one of the things that has always kind of been apparent to me is that very often, if I wanted just a data set on poets, just generally speaking, that's a Google search away, right? But when we look at the metadata on those websites, so I've sometimes done web scraping, I've kind of peeked behind their websites a little bit to see that the data, especially when it's talking about African poets or even Black American poets too, it's not always accurate and it's not fully there in the way that it should be, right? So one of the things that's really been exciting for me and really rejuvenating for me is to see that folks are hard at work trying to create metadata structures for African literary productions that can help researchers in the future. So I think what I want to do now is kind of shift to talk a bit about the sort of work I'm doing to move from collecting information, collecting data, and kind of thinking about big data to actually analyzing it through the Global Poetics Project. And I think that Alex Gill mentioned something earlier about algorithmic approaches to data. So that's what the Global Poetics Project has been moving towards doing now. So we're now approaching the data we collected about poets with specific questions, right? So one such question for the poetry of the global South that we were collecting was, how did we even get to this term of like global Anglophone poetry? Because I work in the Anglophone, right? And when did thinking about poetry around the world emerge? So one of the things we did is we just did a very simple Ngram via Google. And one of the things that I heard earlier in the talks today is that sometimes learning these tools can be quite difficult, and sometimes folks don't have access to it. But the Ngram via Google is one that's free to everybody. So what I'm showing you right now is just an Ngram of some of the major terms that emerge in my work, but then also emerge for the Global Poetics Project. So the first graph you see at the top is, it says like world poetry versus Anglophone poetry versus global poetry, world poetics, global poetics. And then the one that you see right underneath that, I just wanted to get you a closer zoom in on the Anglophone through global poetics. So I just removed world poetry so you can kind of see the movement that's happening. And one of the things that emerged for us is that when we look at the second graph, in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, we start seeing this movement up for people thinking about poetry in a global way. And what we're actually seeing right here is just looking at books that mention these terms and the sort of rise and fall of these terms in books and articles that are housed in Google or that Google has access to. So we kind of see that the term was rising at that time. So then what emerged as a second question for us is, okay, so there's a rise in the 60s and 70s of scholars thinking about poetry around the world, particularly for our purposes, poetry from the global South. Why is this happening, right? And then also, how might we see this manifested amongst the poets of the global South themselves? So what I'm going to do is just quickly show us a network analysis that we were building on the Global Poetics Project website, which can be found. We have this section called Poetry Lab, which houses different poetry related projects. And just to briefly say a little bit about them, we have a poetry map, which is our main project. There's a network analysis, which I'll go into in a moment. We're digitizing a little magazine from Ghana from the 60s called Ocheme, and we're collaborating with the University of Ghana on that. And then there are other little projects that we've been working on. So this is the network analysis that we're trying to put together to say, okay, there's a rise in the 60s and 70s with this terminology about global poetry. We have this database on our website of so many poets. How can we begin to display that information in new ways to help researchers understand poetry of the period? So what we basically did here, and I'll just separate these out for us, is what we see are different poets and the sort of mediums that they coalesced around. So by mediums, that might be a little magazine. So like up here, we have London Magazine, but then that was publishing poets like Walcott. But then we also have like this conference in Germany that featured poets like John Pepper Clark, featured figures like Amy Césaire, also Langston Hughes was present, Wolshienka was there. So it kind of features different poets and writers of the period. So what we're trying to do is we're taking the information that we've just been collecting for so long. And if, for those of you that might be familiar, the data structure behind that has poets' names, their locations, who they were connected with. So we use SQL in the background to kind of connect this all together. But for this one in particular, we're trying to show, okay, we have this data. How do we begin to understand it? How do we begin to analyze it in new ways? And one of the new ways that we're trying to analyze it is by showing how these poets came together, particularly Afro-diasporic poets, particularly poets of the global South, and how they also connected and engaged with poets of the West too, right? Because we're not trying to just think of Africa as this one lone continent through this area studies approach, but we're actually trying to say, okay, there are these poets and these writers that we're interested in, but they engaged with other people. They engaged across national and regional borders. They engaged across linguistic borders as well. So that's one of the things that we're trying to work through with the Global Poetics Project at the moment. So for me, my work in the digital humanities has actively been shifting from collecting information, collecting data, building a corpus, to moving into thinking about, okay, after we do this, what can we do to this data? What can we do with this information to make it useful for researchers, but to also show us, like I was describing earlier, those trends, those movements in literary history that can tell us more, not just about these African poets and these Caribbean poets and these Black poets, but about a field as a whole, right? So we're looking at specific figures, but we're moving beyond it. We're trying to say, okay, this actually impacts literary history beyond the sort of area studies approach that we usually see in comparative literary studies. So I think I will end there, but thank you all so much for being here and for giving this space to talk about this work.
Thank you, Amma. Very interesting presentation. Have a final presenter after which we'll have questions. I see some comments already in there. Please keep them coming so that we can transition to that portion as soon as we're done. So Jennifer, please come in.
Thank you very much. And I just want to mention that my son is quarantined today due to COVID exposure at school. So if you see him hop into the frame, that is why. Shortly after arriving in Zimbabwean territory in the mid-1890s, the British South Africa Police established a small camp in the town of Chinhoyi. Soon, however, British authority was threatened by a spirit medium named Sasa, who had settled at the nearby sacred site of Chirorodziva. Sasa was captured and taken to the police camp with his brothers, precipitating a dramatic series of events still recounted by his descendants. Among them is Sekuru Tute Chigamba, a renowned performer of the Zimbabwean Mbira Dzavadzimu, or Mbira of the ancestral spirits. In Sekuru Chigamba's telling, the British forces demanded that Sasa prove his legitimacy by making rain fall within the hour. Positioned beneath the hot sun, the brothers began to sing, Kakore tenderera kemvura tenderera, kakore tenderera kemvura tenderera, or little cloud, circle around, full of rain, circle around. Soon a small cloud appeared in the sky. The downpour lasted more than a day, and after begging Sasa to halt the rain, the British ordered him to resettle near their encampment. As Sekuru Chigamba recounts, quote, the British said to Sasa, whenever we need rain, we will come to you. You are the best rainmaker in Rhodesia. And people were coming to them to ask for rain, end quote. Sekuru Chigamba's fascinating account of this encounter belongs to the Shona narrative genre of Noroondo, or stories about the past. Drawing on decades of ethnographic work, I approach these narratives through a born digital humanities project titled Sekuru's Stories. Interdisciplinary, ethnographic, and multimedia in format, it concentrates on Tute Chigamba, who is often referred to by the honorific title Sekuru, or grandfather. Born in 1939, Sekuru Chigamba is now 82 years old. He grew up immersed in Zimbabwean music and ritual, as his father was an acolyte for a senior ancestral spirit. Yet his father also worked on a succession of white settler farms, giving the young Tute an intimate view of everyday colonial entanglements. Echoing one of the world's most common 20th century narratives, Sekuru Chigamba migrated to the colonial capital in 1952, where he found work in a white-owned shop and taught himself to play the Mbira Dzavadzimu, becoming one of the world's foremost Mbira musicians. The Mbira Dzavadzimu has been Zimbabwe's most iconic musical tradition since the late 1800s. Because Sekuru Chigamba actively composes new songs for the instrument, his stories offer examples of innovation within a musical tradition often described as inherently conservative in its orientation toward the past. In addition, Sekuru's stories presents a range of other musical practices, from 20th century acoustic guitar playing to endangered Zimbabwean musical bows, such as the mukube, chipendani, and the ground bow. Through Sekuru Chigamba's detailed first-person narratives, Sekuru's stories offers a new way of approaching Zimbabwean history, biography, and memoir, revealing how large-scale historical forces, such as colonization, missionization, nationalism, and cosmopolitanism, emerge within the experiences of a single musical figure. Before I proceed, I want to note how the page you are seeing here fits with my conception of this project. I designed Sekuru Stories as a digital monograph and organized it in sections roughly akin to chapters so that readers could page sequentially through its contents. For this reason, I wanted an initial landing page that felt like the digital analog of a physical book cover. As it turns out, this digital monograph format is still relatively unique in the digital humanities. Although many university presses now work digitally, they tend to employ conventional formats akin to ebooks. On the other hand, projects such as digital archives prioritize the curation of primary source materials rather than interpretation and analysis. Relatively few digital humanities projects, however, present monograph-length work in the form of an interactive website. With its distinctive format, Sekuru Stories has proven exceptionally successful, as I will discuss in a few minutes. Sekuru Stories is designed to encourage different modes of engagement, making it accessible and engaging for general audiences and specialists alike. And here we will open the cover of the digital book and go inside. Organized in chronological order, the first 3 sections of the project, Early Years, Musical Life, and Independence, chart the trajectory of Sekuru Chigamba's life. 2 other sections, Mbira and Ancestors, present Sekuru's specialized knowledge of Zimbabwean music and history. And as you can see here, these sections are organized through the top navigation bar in the website. And within each section are the individual stories that Sekuru tells, which are accessible through the drop-down menus. In addition, each section of the site features introductory and concluding essays, which frame the stories within that section for readers. The last section of the site, titled simply Explore, invites readers to engage with these materials through completely different modes of engagement. This section offers several non-linear paths through the site, inviting viewers to engage with an extensive image gallery and interactive features, such as maps, a family tree, and a timeline. It also features several pages with indigenous Zimbabwean instruments. In this section, readers can access online audio streaming through a SoundCloud playlist, free digital audio downloads through Bandcamp, and a page with Sekuru Chigamba's explanation of the meaning behind many Mbira songs. And here I want to just jump to that page with the meanings of many of the songs. This is one of the pages that took me the most time to build in this entire site. I would estimate that it took me probably over 100 hours. And here you can see the songs that are listed on the site. Here are songs from the Mbira's core repertory, songs that have been played for many years. And here at the bottom, we have Sekuru Chigamba's own original compositions for the instrument. So clicking on any of these songs will take you to his description of what the song means, as well as an audio clip of his music. With support from an ACLS fellowship, I developed Sekuru Stories between April 2018 and September 2019. Through the University of Rochester's Digital Scholarship Lab, I had access to a team of tech professionals, which included programmers, archivists, GIS research specialists, visual technologists, and specialists in metadata, information discovery, and digitization. And I think this speaks to how hard it is to create digital projects with the type of specialized knowledge that is required to build certain kinds of features. After evaluating 3 platforms, Omeka, Scalar, and WordPress, we selected WordPress for international accessibility, customized a theme that suited the project's requirements, and took care to minimize our use of plugins to ensure long-term sustainability. Sekuru Stories is specifically designed to appeal to both English and Shona-speaking readers, as well as readers with an interest in learning the Shona language. Many of Sekuru's stories on the site are available in both Shona and English versions, with a button enabling viewers to move easily between the 2 languages. So here we'll go back up to the top of the songs page, and the Chishona button here at the top right of the page takes us to a mirror page where the same information is presented, but now everything is in Shona, rather than in English. Early on, I made the decision to build Sekuru Stories publicly, giving readers access to the site as I created it. This was both because I sought to build an audience for the project from the beginning, and because I thought readers would be more likely to engage with these extensive materials piece by piece. Through the subscription function on WordPress, I sent out weekly emails. I also shared new material on Facebook through my personal page and in groups for the global Zimbabwean music community. People began reading Sekuru Stories immediately, with 162 users on the first day. These numbers picked up quickly, with more than 300 readers in the first week, 500 in the first month, and 2,200 in the first year, for a total of over 20,000 individual page views. Presently, over 14,000 individual users have accessed the site since it was launched in January 2019. During the build phase, Sekuru Stories' major readership was in the United States and Canada, followed by a secondary concentration in Southern Africa. Gradually, however, this situation has reversed, and most readers are now located in Zimbabwe and South Africa, followed by the US and the UK. In the past month, for example, just over 1,100 users have visited Sekuru Stories. Fully 700 of them are in Zimbabwe, representing 65% of the site's recent readership. And of the 14,000 individual users who have accessed the site since its inception, nearly 5,000 have been in Zimbabwe, with another 2,000 readers in South Africa. Together, this represents roughly half of the total readership for the project. The US and UK, on the other hand, jointly account for just over 4,000 users, or roughly a third of the project's total readership. The digital humanities offers unique opportunities to work toward co-authored projects. As we worked together on this project, Sekuru Chigamba read over and commented on all of my translations and transcriptions. With funding from the University of Rochester, he also came to campus to workshop the material with myself and 3 other ethnomusicologists, all of whom he knew from their previous travel to Zimbabwe as graduate students. Our discussions at this workshop proved essential in enabling me to develop the theoretical framing for the individual stories on the site, bringing our voices together much more closely than if I had written this material on my own. As Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Young remind us, decolonization is not a metaphor. Rather, it is the struggle for, quote, the repatriation of indigenous land and life, end quote. While co-authorship conveys limited benefits within the international framework of intellectual property rights, it does little to change material inequalities. To this end, when I was awarded the ACLS Fellowship for Sekuru Stories, I found it important to share this funding with Sekuru Chigamba. With slightly over half the fellowship money, he purchased a 4-bedroom home for his wife and young children, who are currently 7 and 9 years old. During COVID-19, I then began teaching an online community Mbira class to support my 3 primary Mbira teachers in Zimbabwe, all of whom have been affected through canceled tours and the demise of international travel. Over 15 months, these classes have raised a total of over $35,000. Even more than writing articles, teaching classes, and presenting at conferences, I am happy to collaborate with my Mbira teachers in Zimbabwe on projects in which they, rather than I, derive the primary economic benefits. The struggle for the repatriation of indigenous life and land remains incomplete. As such, our efforts to work towards scholarship that is not only symbolically, but also materially decolonial must remain ongoing and subject to critique and revision at all times. Digital, online, and applied approaches to scholarship hold great promise for those of us who are committed to the co-creative process of this ethical imperative. I will end there so that we have sufficient time for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, for your presentation. I'll have to switch to my phone because I was having Wi-Fi issues. So we are open for questions. I'll just read some of the comments that have come through, and the panelists are welcome to respond to any of them if necessary. So Caitlyn Tyler Richards was talking about the idea of working from a place of uncertainty, feeling quite productive, which I agree with. And I think it also connects with the humility point that was made earlier on. So I don't know if Kwaishola, you want to comment on a bit more on the idea of working from a place of uncertainty, or any of the other presenters, because you all seem to be doing something similar in terms of recuperating certain aspects of not just history, but literary practices that resonate with a certain cultural moment. So I don't know if any of you want to comment on that, or if they want to.
Yeah, I think I've already said my main points. So, but
Okay.
I'll just reiterate, if need be, that I think that it's a good place, especially when we're approaching archival work and practice. This sense of needing to be definitive in what we do is important. And there is a part of it that is important, and how we professionalize ourselves as far as like practitioners and jobs and things of that nature. But when it really comes down to it, there's a need to kind of lay bare, like, you know, I think that's probably the problem, that when we see finished products, right, we don't see products in process. We don't see products that are also kind of, these are the challenges. We don't even see people reflecting back on challenges. So it comes off as this kind of authoritative work that is already polished. But even just things as simple as what Jennifer did, revealing the labor, revealing what went into making the project, revealing all these different things are so important into how we construct our projects. And those are things that I'm thinking about constantly. And when we think about this nature of writing back to this larger colonial narrative of the archive, I think that is important, that we do not reproduce those same logics and problems that we've seen in the past. So I'll rest my case there.
Yeah, I think I can add 2 points to what was just said, perhaps. One being that when we try not to recreate the errors of the archive, one of the things that has always been like a point of interest for me is that in the background, when like you're developing these like metadata structures, it even becomes important to think about like, what terminology am I using to describe certain things, and why am I coming to these terms, right? So like, for example, when I first started creating like the spreadsheet that supports the background of like the map for the Global Poetics Project, for example, I was working with parts of the US. So you would have things like state, city, town, like even like terms that you use to denote location change depending upon where you are. So a term like region for the US might be like Northeast USA, right? But then a term like region means a completely different thing depending on the place you're in. And then it's like, how do I use this term, and how do I put this, like how much sort of emphasis do I put on these terms depending on the places I'm working in, when you're working on all these places in the same spot? So that becomes really important. And then one other thing that I'll just kind of say quickly is that one of the sort of ambivalencies of working with archives and then also working with digital archives is that physical archives are very often lacking the specifics of the sorts of people that I may want to be working with. So for example, I'm working with this 1960s physical archive, and I'm trying to take those poets and put them into network models. One of the issues that arises is that not everyone's name is listed in the list of attendees. Not everybody is listed for the sort of work and labor they put in. Not everyone is listed according to, I mean, there's some people who are listed and their names are even spelled incorrectly by whoever was transcribing for the day. So there's that sort of uncertainty with working with physical archives. When you're trying to kind of translate that into digital archives, it's always like, well, who's missing from this, and where can I try to find?
Yeah, I'll just chime in too to say that I think one of the most exciting and challenging things about the digital humanities in general is that it's still very much a space of experimentation, right? And this is reflected in the fact that there is not a clearly designed peer review process or entity that would even shepherd projects through a peer review process for digital humanities projects. this is a disadvantage when it comes to issues like hiring, promotion, and tenure. But it is also an advantage in that it enables us to bypass the kinds of gatekeeping that have often prevented us from doing work that might be really important but does not meet certain scholarly criteria. So I think there is a sort of uncertainty, and I would even add perhaps a vulnerability in working in the digital humanities right now that is both liberating and also challenging, right? And so I think that this position of uncertainty is one that we have to kind of think about as a way to maybe even challenge some of the conventions that have guided people's work up to the present. How can we use the work of the digital humanities to reshape the peer review process more generally, rather than simply applying, previously existing processes of peer review to the digital humanities? So I think this is a place where we see the digital humanities offering very much promise to us as scholars in terms of critiquing the ways that things have conventionally been done, which are exclusionary, right?
I would like to add something to that, and it struck me as I was listening to your presentation, Jennifer, is also about, when we talk about collaboration, about making the process whereby it's a dialogue, it's dialogical in the sense that we're in dialogue, especially if you happen to be working on a project that still engages the community of practice that you're working with. So whether, for me, these are technologies are still alive, I can capture their oral histories. It's Sekou Touré, and as well as Ama with the poets that are still living that you can interact with. How can we include their voices there? We can't objectify their voices. These are living people. How do we make their voice come alive? And, looking something simple as, transcribing, sharing transcriptions. For me, I did a lot of my interviews over Zoom. So, I had someone do the transcriptions. So I have to look over, and it's like, I'm almost like I'm doing the transcription again, because it's just a mess. Like I just can't. So I have to look over it, because obviously language and all those things, and then I still have to circulate it back to them. But I want to have that person's voice. So I'm thinking, how can I do voiceover and like add it, so have that interactivity. So, and still have that person there, so make it alive in a sense. So those are very important things that we can do, even just to humanize the archive, and still, kind of remove it from that it is a technology, it is an object, but we're trying to rewrite that. So that's just something that was I thought I wanted to know as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Very comprehensive responses. We are almost out of time, so there's another question which I think everyone could sort of provide their perspective on, and then we can see if we'll be allowed time to continue. But before I do that, I'll just say that someone has been inspired by your presentations. She's interested in doing a master's in the area. So thank you guys for all your work. But there's a question of who is included in your community as you do your work. So I don't know if all of you would like to just like chip in your perspectives on that, and then we'll proceed from there. Okay, so everyone is waiting for someone else to go. So Ama, could you start?
Sure. So let me start by saying this, that one of the terms that I like to use when describing my project is we. Even if I worked on a section of the project by myself, I still use the word we, because I know that I'm working with publics beyond myself. So to make that a bit more concrete, we're working with living poets and poets who have already transitioned. So some of those living poets actually give us their information. So we actually have a form, it's interactive. You can submit information, which then gets cleaned and put onto our map. Like I'm thinking about the mapping section of our project. We also have people that we call poet ambassadors, who are folks on the ground who are, able to tell us what conferences are happening, what festivals are occurring, and to be our sort of really public facing folks. And I also think of them as interlocutors, in the sense that they are really the poets on the ground, and they can inform me on the sorts of practices we should be having. But then it's also like other scholars, right? I've had people email me before to say like, hey, this is, some things that might make your project more useful for me as a researcher, or things that might make your project more useful for me as a student. So I would say that those sorts of folks are my varying publics. I really, in some ways, I kind of want to think of the Global Poetics Project as part of this larger thing I have, which is Idea Incubator Labs, which is just that like, I never want to be the center of the project, I really want the people interacting with the project to really be what it is. I don't want it to ever be like there's someone leading it, even though technically I am. I really want it to be a group effort in many ways.
So I would add, like, when I started this, I actually like reached out to a couple of people that, and I was like, oh yeah, I want to do this. Let's do this together and all that. But, you know, and they were super supportive, but they were like, I'm not going to do that. You go ahead and do it. We support you. And I was just like, okay, that's fine to me. So like that now, because I want that community effect. So for me, the community I'm thinking about is primary communities, the technologists on ground, contemporary historical, who have been involved in technology, innovation and entrepreneurship in Lagos from, I guess you could even say from 1970s to present day. So talking to these different people, so it's now like I have to really carry them along because I know they're not gonna, like, they don't want to do meetings, they don't have time, they're like investors, they're busy. You know, I had like a 70-year-old man, he's like, I can't be on Zoom for this long, it's too much. So for him, so, and these are real issues, and so I have to now make, because it is important to me to carry the community along. So I have to be deliberate and intentional in the way that I do that. So that, and then researchers, obviously, but that's probably going to be a community that's going to come in much later. I haven't interacted with a lot of researchers doing my research thus far. And then the next one would be like the global technologists that are currently like tech companies, Google's, these other people that are in the narrative of technology but don't care about Africa. So so it's important. So
yeah, and I think I've already talked about readership, so I'll just talk more about collaboration, like on the back end of creating this project. It was so much more collaborative than I ever could have imagined, because Sekuru Chigamba really is a very well-known figure, and so many people have interacted with him, everyone from the BBC to various scholars to nonprofit organizations. And as I was conducting the actual build for this project, I kept realizing how much material was out there and reaching out. And soon people from the BBC were sending me boxes of old DAT tapes and photographs that I could digitize. And I ended up acquiring an entire archive of a Zimbabwean photographer who passed away in 1995. And I'll just show one of his photos that is featured on the site. He did amazing work, and that work was kind of languishing in a trunk in the home of one of his friends who was also a photographer. And as part of this project, I ended up digitizing that archive also. So it's like so tentacular, I find, once you start the digital work, the way that it can house media in so many forms, like naturally leads to all kinds of conversations and collaborations that are not expected necessarily at the outset. And I was very surprised at how many scholars just said, sure, here's all the interviews I ever did with this person, or sure, here are all the DAT tapes I ever made. They're yours. They're just sitting in my attic. Go ahead and use them, right? So it was really incredible.
Okay, thank you all. We've been given the green light to field the two questions in the Q&A. So Amma, there's a question for you. Ashley Harris asking if you could say a bit more about how to link various initiatives on metadata capture so as to work together towards a larger infrastructural contribution for informal or non-published African literatures.
Of course. So one thing I would say, and I think that's a really good point, because a lot of people work on these smaller individual projects, and sometimes it's like, is there a way to bring these together? So one thing that has worked for me is I've had folks who were working on, people that work in poetry, broadly speaking, that will say, I did research on X, I have some information on it. And I've actually had people just email me things, just like raw, like unclean data, which I then incorporated into the Global Poetics Project, which has been quite helpful. So I think making those connections with other researchers who might not necessarily consider themselves DH folks, but they just have like data languishing on their laptops is a connection that I found to be quite useful in some ways. But another thing is, I think just like settings like this are also really quite helpful, because when we meet other people that are working perhaps in overlapping or similar fields, and able to say like, hey, you're working on this data, I work on it and I interpret it and I visualize it in a different way. Is it possible to share that information? That might be one way, but then another might be just to figure out who's working on what and just put it all on a Google Drive somewhere, like a bunch of links. Even that would be like a sort of low tech way of going about doing that. But yeah, I see it as really necessary because people are working on different things and they overlap in some ways. Like just a quick thing is that I work on poets, yes, but poets are engaging with artists, they're engaging with filmmakers, they're engaging with musicians, they're engaging with dancers, right? They're engaging with all politicians, right? So all of that information actually could be like networked and connected together and would be actually really, really interesting. So I think just collecting those projects, even on a Google Doc of some sort, would be really helpful for the field.
Okay, and Jennifer, there's a question of Jude Nwabwoke is asking, do we have to incorporate some form of ethnographic research to thoroughly do an archiving of African folklore? He asks because he finds your engagement with the Mbira-Lorik tradition quite fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, this really speaks to the issue of gatekeeping, which I've raised before. Like, I'm not an expert on the Mbira Tsavadzimu. I'm a student of the Mbira Tsavadzimu, and I don't know any scholars who are experts on the Mbira Tsavadzimu. The experts are there in Zimbabwe. They're the Mbira players. They're people who have played since they were 5 years old. But because of the way the institution is set up, those people do not have degrees. Because they do not have degrees, they're not allowed to represent their own traditions in scholarly contexts. And they possibly don't have the same modes of communication that would be expected in scholarly contexts, the theoretical language or the writing skills, right? So this is an eternal problem. Like, where are the experts? And how do the voices of the experts become available to us, right? This was a primary motivation for creating Sekuru Stories, was just to give Sekuru a chance to be the expert and for his voice to speak in a kind of unmediated way, so that what we're reading are his stories, not an analysis of his stories, not me cannibalizing his stories for the purposes of scholarship and coming up with my own analysis where he gets a few quotes in there, right? But rather, can we hear from one of the experts? Can we understand his analysis of Zimbabwean history, music, and culture? So I think if we're really genuinely interested in indigenous practices, be that language or religious or musical or cultural practices, we must go to indigenous experts who most of the time are not the educated scholars, right? We know that the combination, the way colonialism worked was to separate people from their indigenous traditions through Western style education that removed people from indigenous contexts, right? So I do think that until we can revamp this system, right, which is a bifurcated system in which indigenous experts are not legitimized, then we must be doing ethnographic work.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so final one to Koinshola. It's not a question, it's more of a suggestion from Augustine. And he says, your project is highly impressive and he feels it would be good to include the activities of non-formally educated computer specialists and their refurbishing at the computer village in Ikeja. So it sounds similar to what Jennifer was saying. So it's a suggestion, but I don't know if you want to speak to it before.
Yeah, that is something that is actually going to be a part of the project, but for now, because of scope, Computer Village is an entire ecosystem on its own. And actually, the project that I'm doing is capturing the history, because Computer Village is actually an offshoot of what I'm studying. It started, there were traders, and most of them were in Sri Lanka. They were in like other parts of it before they moved in the 90s. So there's actually a historical migration. So they didn't start off there. So I am going to incorporate that, but we're working through it. But I actually did do some interview with, I did some interview with the, just to tell him, with the president of CAPDAN. I actually spoke to the Computer Village chairman or president, so.
They're usually the chairman. Okay, so thank you. So we started with Alex and we'll end with Alex. He has a comment. It's to Koinshola and Amma, but you can connect it to Jennifer as well. He says, he particularly loves the way you put pressure on understanding the archive, and the projects help us to start understanding the extent of what is on the surface as much as what lies in the gaps of our material reality. So thank you all for this presentation, this set of presentations. Really enjoyed it. And there are many comments in there. People are asking all kinds of questions and making all kinds of suggestions. I recommend you check them out and we continue the conversation offline. Thank you and have a good evening.
So thank you so very much, Dr. Corbett. Thank you everyone for your patience. It's been a great time just having you in the house as speakers, as attendees, and to Brian, who has been working behind the scene, just everyone. I'm just so excited and grateful for your participation. I want to thank Dr. Alex Hill and Hlonipha Mokeona, who has left us, just to appreciate you all for being here, for making this a success. And we have recorded the event today. Hopefully you can check back on our website if you want a record of this, but definitely we'll have the video online as soon as we can, probably in the next week or so. I should also say that I see in the chat that people are already sharing emails, forming networks and connections. That's really important. And like Emmanuel was getting us to think, it's good that we do this with an eye on non-extractive relationships with archives and communities back on the continent. So let's keep the networks alive. Let's continue to draw from the continent, collaborating and having productive networks. I should say finally that we will be having a next program next month, and it's Digital Indaba. The Digital Indaba is an occasional series where we bring people to elaborate more on their work. So perhaps we could invite Amma if she wants to tell us more amazing stuff about our work, to have more time to discuss our work with an expert from the African continent. So for next month, we plan on having a discussion on digital memories of the Nigerian Biafra War, and it's by a Nigerian journalist based in the UK. Hopefully we have somebody in conversation with her from the country or from the diaspora. We'll have word on that particular event out very soon, so please be on the lookout. But for now, thank you so very much. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your contributions and expertise. And hopefully we can continue to count on you as we grow and build this community together. I think it's time to draw the curtain. See you guys online.